She was 21 years old when her family drove away from the house during a Category 4 hurricane and left her inside it. They boarded her bedroom window from the outside. They cut the power before they left. And they filed a $44,000 insurance claim in her name while she sat in the hallway closet, counting the seconds between gusts. Her name is Nora. She is 28 years old. And what her grandmother had been building in secret for 6 years, she would not find out until the morning the lawyer called. Not this house, not the one I grew up in, not the one my father loaded into 2 trucks and drove away from while I stood on the porch in the August heat, watching the taillights disappear around the bend where Marsh Road curves toward the highway. That house my parents have been renting since October. 2 bedrooms on the wrong side of Caldwell, Georgia, $840 a month, no yard, street parking. My father's truck in the spot closest to the door, because some habits are permanent even when everything else has changed. The house I mean is the one I am sitting in right now. Screened porch, herb garden, the oak tree in the backyard that my grandmother planted the year she retired, and that has, in the 12 years since, grown taller than the roofline. Her house. My house now. The deed transferred 11 months ago on a Tuesday morning in a lawyer's office above a barber shop on Clement Street, in front of my parents and my brother, and a woman named who had been my grandmother's neighbor for 38 years, and who held her purse in both hands the whole time like she was bracing for weather. My grandmother had been preparing that morning for 6 years. She just wasn't alive to see it. What I want to tell you before I tell you about the lawyer's office and the deed, and the 51 missed calls I woke up to the morning after, is what my grandmother was doing in the 6 years between the hurricane and the morning she died. What she was building, quietly, in the leather notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and wrote in every evening on this porch in the particular blue-black ink she used for everything. Grocery lists, garden schedules, evidence. Because that is what the notebook was, in the end. Evidence, assembled by a woman who understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 40 years as a hospital nurse, that some things need to be documented before the people who caused them can revise the history. She documented everything. She had been documenting since the morning of the storm, sitting in the back seat of my mother's car while they drove north on the highway, pressing her palm flat against the rear window as they pulled out of the driveway. I saw her hand through the screen door. I pressed mine back. That was the last thing that passed between us before the storm hit. 2 palms separated by glass and 30 feet of driveway, and everything that had already been decided without either of us being consulted. 7 years later, on a Tuesday morning in March, I sat in a lawyer's office and watched my father's face go the color of wet concrete when he understood what my grandmother had been writing in that notebook all along. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the house, to the summer I was 21, to the whiteboard my father mounted on the kitchen wall 3 days before the storm, with 2 columns and a black marker that squeaked on every downstroke. My name was not in either column. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She was 73 years old the summer of the hurricane, retired from 40 years of nursing, and in possession of the clearest mind I have ever encountered in any person at any age. She read 2 novels a week. She grew herbs in Latin, not by their common names but their proper ones, because she believed, as she believed about most things, that precision was a form of respect. She kept a leather notebook in her apron pocket and wrote in it every evening in blue-black ink with a left-handed slant that made her sentences look like they were leaning into the future. She had lived in this house since 1987. 4 bedrooms, screened porch, herb garden, the oak tree she planted when it was a sapling she carried home from a nursery in a paper bag. My parents moved in when I was 8, after my father's contracting business had what he described as a slow patch and what the bank described differently. Temporary, he told my grandmother. She did not say anything. She simply moved the spare bedroom furniture to make room for his toolbox and my mother's clothes, and a folding cot for my brother, and a twin mattress on the floor for me. That was 13 years before the storm. Temporary. The kitchen table seated 4. There were 5 of us, then 6 when my grandmother made it 7 people in the house on holidays. Every night I pulled the metal folding chair from the hall closet and wedged myself between the counter and my brother's elbow. Nobody suggested getting a 5th chair. The way a lot of things about me never got suggested. Was 25 that summer. He worked at my father's contracting business, such as it still was driving the truck, carrying materials, showing up when he remembered. My parents spoke about this the way they spoke about all things did, with a warmth I had spent 21 years trying to earn through different methods. One Tuesday in June, my mother set a casserole on the table and announced that had been made lead driver. She said it with the voice she used for achievements. I cleared my throat. I got the apprenticeship. The electrician's program at the trade center, the one I had applied to 3 times and been accepted to on the 3rd. My mother passed the salad too. That's nice, honey. My father did not look up from his plate. At the end of the table, my grandmother set her fork down. She looked at me in the way she looked at me, as though she were reading something the others could not see. Electrical work, she said. Good hands run in this family. My father chewed. My mother smiled at something on her phone, asked for more bread. After dinner, I washed the dishes alone. Through the window above the sink, I could see the herb garden, rosemary, thyme, sage, basil, planted in rows so precise they looked measured. My grandmother was on the porch with the leather notebook open on her knee, writing in the low amber light of the evening, her left hand moving across the page in that forward-leaning slant. I did not ask what she was writing. I assumed it was garden schedules or the kind of lists a woman keeps to organize a life. I should have asked, but she would not have shown me then. She showed me things on her schedule, not mine, and her schedule, I understood later, was a great deal longer and more deliberate than any of us knew. 3 months before the storm, she called me to the porch on a Saturday afternoon while we were deadheading the marigolds along the fence line. She reached into her apron pocket and handed me something. A flashlight. Yellow plastic, wide beam, heavy for its size. Keep this, she said. What for? When the lights go out, you'll need your own light. I laughed. Grandma, we have a generator. She looked at me steadily. The generator belongs to your father, she said. Flat, like a weather report. Then she went back to the marigolds and said nothing more about it. I put the flashlight in my room. I did not think about it again until the morning of the storm, when my father was in the garage loading plywood into his truck, and my mother was folding clothes into a suitcase, and I walked to my bedroom to find it already on my nightstand, as though someone had moved it there on purpose. My grandmother. She had put it where I would find it. She had known, 3 months before the storm, that I was going to need it. Before I go further, if you have ever been the person whose name wasn't on the list, whose place at the table required a folding chair from the hall closet, whose window someone else decided to board shut, leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one, and I need you with me for what comes next, because what my grandmother was writing in that notebook every evening on this porch, I did not find out until 6 years after the storm. And it changed everything. My father bought the whiteboard on a Wednesday, 3 days before landfall. He drove to the hardware store on Route 9 in the morning and came back with it in the truck bed, still in the packaging, along with 2 sheets of plywood, a box of 3-inch screws, and a set of window brackets he did not end up needing. He mounted the whiteboard on the kitchen wall next to the refrigerator that afternoon using a level he borrowed from his own toolbox, and a drill whose sound I had grown up associating with work being done and things being fixed. He uncapped a black marker. It squeaked on every downstroke. He drew 2 columns. Left column, car 1. Right column, car 2. Under car 1, in his precise contractor's block lettering, Documents, toolbox, undercar 2, suitcases, photo albums, silverware set. I read the list once, then twice, then a third time the way you reread a sentence that cannot possibly say what it says, slowly, from left to right, hopping the meaning will change if you approach it differently. My name was not in either column. Neither was biscuit, pepper, or fig. The 2 dogs and the cat who had been mine since before this house was mine to lose. I found my father in the garage loading the plywood into the truck bed. He was methodical about it, sliding each sheet in flat, stacking them with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years working with materials that had to be handled correctly, or the whole thing failed. "What about me?" I said. He didn't stop stacking. "Someone has to stay, Nora. Insurance won't cover the claim if the house is left unoccupied during a named storm event. It's a Category 4. This house survived." He pulled a nail from between his teeth. "You'll be fine. Take the animals to the hallway closet if it gets bad. Stay away from windows." I looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at something that has been in front of you your entire life and that you have been misreading, not because you weren't paying attention, but because you were reading the version of it you needed to be true rather than the version that was actually there. His hands were steady. His voice was flat. He had already decided before he asked. He had decided, I understood later, when he drew the 2 columns on the whiteboard and neither of them had room for a 5th name. I went inside. My mother was folding clothes into a suitcase on the bed, moving with the focused efficiency of a woman who had a destination and a timeline and had organized her attention accordingly. "Mom," I stood in the doorway. "Someone has to watch the house. I could go, could stay." She zipped the suitcase without looking up. "Your brother has a job site Monday." As if I didn't. As if the apprenticeship I had worked 8 months to get, the 3 applications, the background check, the $400 in tools I had bought with money saved from 2 years of weekend shifts at the diner on Orchard Street, was a hobby. Something I did in the margins of other people's real lives. I walked to the back of the house. My grandmother was in the kitchen doorway, both hands on her cane, her jaw set in the particular way it set when she had heard something she intended to address. "Over my dead body," she said to my father as he passed through the hall with a box of documents. He didn't slow his pace. "It's not your decision anymore, Ruth. It's my house now." My grandmother straightened. Her eyes went flat, and still the way water goes still before it freezes, not emptied, but concentrated, every degree of temperature gathered into a single surface tension. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly what I'm afraid of." My father was already past her. He didn't hear. Or he heard and it didn't register, which amounted to the same outcome. I heard every word. I heard them and I did not understand what she meant. Not yet. My grandmother did not argue further. She did not raise her voice or block the door or make any of the scenes that might have stopped what was already in motion. She simply went to her room and came back with the yellow flashlight, the one she had handed me 3 months ago in the garden, the one I had put on my nightstand and not thought about since. She set it on the kitchen counter, beside my hand. Her fingers were cold and steady. "You know where the closet is," she said. "Interior walls on all sides. No windows." I looked at her. She looked at me. "I'm going to fix this," she said. "Give me time." I did not ask what she meant. I was 21. I thought time meant things would get better eventually, the way things do when you are young enough to believe that eventually is a real destination rather than a direction. I did not know she meant it literally. They left at 6:45 in the morning. The sky was the color of a bruise, green at the edges, yellow toward the center. The particular sky that makes birds go quiet and dogs press their bodies against the floor and every living thing that has learned to read whether understand that the reading is bad. My father loaded the last box into his truck, sat in the passenger seat with his earbuds in, phone already up, his attention fully allocated to somewhere that was not this driveway and not me standing on the porch in a gray t-shirt with biscuit pressed against my left leg. He did not wave. He did not look up. My mother helped my grandmother to the car. I watched from the porch. My grandmother resisted. I could see it in the way her hand gripped the car door frame, the way her weight shifted back rather than forward, the way my mother's hand pressed flat and firm against her back in the universal gesture of a person ending a conversation rather than continuing one. "Ruth, you can't stay. Your heart." My grandmother turned to look at me through the rear window as the car door closed. Her mouth moved. I could not hear through the glass. She pressed her palm flat against the window. I pressed mine against the porch screen. Then the car backed out of the driveway, and the tail lights disappeared around the bend, where Marsh Road curves toward the highway, and the sound of the engine faded into the particular silence that follows when something that was present is suddenly and completely gone. My father was last. He came around the side of the house with the plywood sheet and the drill and the box of screws. He leaned the plywood against my bedroom wall, positioned it across the window frame, and began. I stood inside the room and watched the light change. First, the window went from full to partial, the morning sky visible only in a narrowing rectangle as the plywood rose, then to a strip, then to a crack, then to nothing. 4 screws, each one driven through the wood frame with a high, thin sound that I have not been able to in the 7 years since, a sound like a fingernail on porcelain, precise and final. "So you don't get any ideas about leaving," he said through the plywood. His voice was muffled by 3/4-inch pressboard. Then it was gone, replaced by boots on gravel, a truck door, an engine, and then the specific silence of a house that has been left to weather something alone. I stood in my sealed bedroom for a long moment. The room was dim now, not dark, but the particular half-light of a space that has been deliberately cut off from its source. I could see the yellow flashlight on the nightstand. My grandmother had put it there. She had known this morning was coming, in some form, for months. She had put the light where I would find it in the same deliberate way she put everything, carefully, in the right place, for the right person. I picked it up. It fit in my hand, the way things fit when they were chosen for you specifically. I walked to the breaker panel in the hallway because the hall light had gone dark. Every switch was flipped down. My mother had cut the main power before she got in the car to protect the wiring, she had said the day before. But she had not done it the day before. She had done it this morning, after my grandmother was already in the car and the car door was already closed and there was no one left to object. The house was dark. Not evening dark, sealed dark. The kind of dark where you cannot tell if your eyes are open or closed until you move your hand in front of your face and track its passage. I turned on the yellow flashlight. The beam cut the hallway clean. Biscuit pressed against my left leg. Pepper pressed against my right. Fig sat on the kitchen counter with her ears flat and her eyes moving across the ceiling in the way of animals who understand things through pressure rather than sight and are registering something building. I looked at my phone. 14% battery, 1 bar of signal dropping. The storm had a name. I don't use it. What happened wasn't the storm's fault. I want to tell you what a Category 4 hurricane sounds like from inside a house with no power and a boarded window. It does not begin with violence. It begins with wind, low and constant at first, the kind you can almost mistake for highway traffic if you are trying hard enough to mistake it. Then the wind finds the gaps, the places where the house is not quite sealed, where age has opened small conversations between the structure and the outside air. The wind enters those conversations and makes them louder. Then the pressure changes. Your ears register it before your mind does. A slow, deep compression, as though the sky has put its hand over everything and is pressing down with the patient, impersonal weight of something that does not notice what is underneath it. I was in the hallway closet by 8 o'clock. Interior walls on all sides. No windows. Exactly where my grandmother had told me to go in the particular way. She told me things that mattered simply, specifically, without explanation, trusting that I would remember. I sat on the floor with Biscuit on my left and Pepper on my right and Fig in my lap, her claws pricking my thighs each time the house groaned. The walls shuddered in long, slow waves. Somewhere above us, something tore free from the roof and skittered across the shingles with a sound like a playing card down a staircase. The hallway closet smelled like coats, and the cedar blocks my grandmother used in every closet of this house, and the specific dry warmth of a small enclosed space that has been used and cared for many years. I pressed my back against the rear wall. I pointed the flashlight at the ceiling. I breathed. My phone said 9%. I called my grandmother. She picked up on the first ring. Baby. Her voice cracked on the word in the particular way voices crack when a person has been holding something together, and the sound of the right voice undoes the holding. I'm okay, Grandma. I'm in the closet. Dogs are with me. Fig too. The walls are holding. A silence, then the sound of her breathing steadying. I tried to stop them, she said. I tried. I know. I'm going to fix this. Her voice was different now, not the panic voice, the other one. The one she used when she had already decided something. Give me time. My phone said 6%. I have to go, Grandma. I know. A pause. I love you. I love you more, I said, and longer. That was a thing she had said to me since I was 4 years old. It started as a game and became a fact, and somewhere between the two stopped needing to be either. I hung up. I turned the phone face down to save the remaining battery. I sat in the dark with the yellow flashlight on the floor beside me, pointed at the ceiling, its beams steady and wide in the sealed space. Outside, the storm was at full voice now. The sound had passed through identifiable stages, wind, then rain, then something that was no longer either of those things separately but had become something else, a combined pressure that stopped being sound and became physical. You felt it in your chest, in the spaces behind your eyes, in the way the walls moved, not violently but in long, slow shudders, as though the house was breathing through something it had not been designed to breathe through. I did what you do when there is nothing to do. I breathed, I counted, I remembered. I thought about the afternoon I was 13, and my father spread a set of blueprints across the kitchen table and taught me how to read elevation lines. He was patient that day, genuinely patient, the specific patience of a man who enjoys teaching what he knows to someone who is paying attention. He pointed to the foundation markings. This is where the house starts, he said. Everything else stands on this. It was one of the few afternoons I could remember where he spoke to me as though I were worth the teaching. Sitting in the closet with 3 animals and a dying flashlight while the roof did what it did, I understood that the man who drew those lines and explained foundations, and the man who drew 2 columns on a whiteboard with no room for my name, were not different versions of the same person. They were the same person. I had been choosing to read the blueprint afternoon over the whiteboard, choosing the version that fit the story I needed to tell about my family. The storm made that particular choice impossible. In the sealed dark of my grandmother's hallway closet, I let the story I had been telling myself come apart the way wet cardboard comes apart. Not dramatically, not all at once, but thoroughly, without the possibility of reassembly into the original shape. The winds dropped around 4 in the morning. I opened the closet door into a hallway full of the particular silence that follows extreme sound, the specific quiet of air that has been used violently and is now resting. Thin white lines of early light showed through the cracks in the plywood over my bedroom window. 4 screws, 4 cracks. The house had stood. The garden was flat. Every herb bed flattened, the rosemary laid sideways, the sage pressed to the ground. The oak tree at the back had lost 2 large branches. They lay across the yard in the new morning light like things that had given up. I checked my phone, 2%. I checked the house room by room, the flashlight cutting ahead of me through rooms that had been rearranged by pressure. A cabinet door open that had been shut, a picture shifted on the wall, the kitchen faucet dripping though no one had turned it on. Pepper pressed his nose into my palm when I came back to the hallway, checking, making sure I was still real. I crouched down and held his face in both hands. "Yeah," I said, "I'm still here." Something had broken during the night that had nothing to do with the roof, or the windows, or the plywood over my bedroom frame. Something deeper and more structural. The part of me that had been making excuses for the whiteboard, and the folding chair and the casserole passed without comment, and the apprenticeship acknowledged in the same voice as a minor inconvenience. That part had come apart in the dark. And sitting on the hallway floor in the early morning light with Pepper's face in my hands and Biscuit leaning against my back and Fig watching from the kitchen counter with her ears slowly returning to their natural position, I understood something my grandmother had understood for much longer. Some pipes, when they finally burst, cannot be repaired with the same materials. You need to replace the whole assembly. I did not have those tools yet, but I knew I would. My grandmother had already started building them. I just did not know that yet. 3 days later, my father's truck pulled into the driveway, tires crunching over fallen branches. He got out, walked past me on the porch, and went inside. He checked the walls. He checked the roof from the attic hatch. He ran his hand along the baseboards, crouched by the water heater, opened and closed every cabinet in the kitchen. He was inspecting the house. "House looks good," he said, coming back through the front door. "You did fine." He did not say, "You're okay." He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "That must have been frightening," or "Let me look at you," or anything that acknowledged that a person had been inside the house as opposed to a security system. He said, "House looks good." Like I was the night shift guard, and my report was satisfactory. My mother carried her suitcase to the bedroom. "Oh, it smells musty. We should open the windows." To no one in particular. She did not comment on the plywood still screwed over my bedroom window. She did not ask how I had slept, or whether I had slept, or what I had eaten across 3 days of no power. Came in eventually. He got a soda from the fridge. There was no power. The fridge was warm, but there was a soda, and went to his room. I stood in the kitchen and counted the seconds since anyone had spoken to me directly. I got to 380 before my grandmother's taxi pulled up to the curb. She had taken a cab from the hotel, $62, no one to ask for a ride, because she had not waited for anyone to offer. She came through the front door, walked past everyone, and found me at the sink. She wrapped her arms around me and held on. She smelled like hotel soap and peppermint, and something older underneath, lavender sachets and cedar, and the specific warm smell that belonged only to her and to this house, and to the particular safety of a person who has always been the one fixed point. "I'm going to fix this," she whispered into my hair. She had said it on the phone during the storm. She had said it in the driveway before the car backed out. Standing in the kitchen with the August light coming through the window so bright it hurt after 3 days of sealed dark, I heard it differently. She was not making a promise out of panic. She was describing a plan she had already started. I was 21. I thought time meant things would eventually get better on their own. I did not know she had already opened the leather notebook to a fresh page and begun recording the first entry in blue-black ink with her left-handed forward-leaning slant. September 15th. Boarded Nora's window from outside. I was in Scar. I could not stop it. She wrote that entry the same evening they returned. She had been writing ever since. And she would not stop until the notebook was finished, and Marshall had everything he needed, and I had everything she could give me. Which was more than any of us knew. I need to stop here for a moment. If you have ever stood in a room full of people who were supposed to love you and counted the seconds until someone spoke to you directly, leave me a comment. Tell me what number you got to. Because what my grandmother was writing in that notebook, while my father inspected the baseboards and my mother complained about the smell, I did not find out for 6 more years. My grandmother had not been writing garden schedules. She had been writing something else entirely. And she had been writing it since the morning of the storm, from the back seat of my mother's car, with her palm pressed flat against the rear window. Stay with me. I packed my car on a Thursday in November. It did not take long. I owned a duffel bag of clothes, a toolbox I had built piece by piece over 8 months of apprenticeship wages, the yellow flashlight, 3 leashes, a cat carrier, and the specific knowledge of exactly where I stood in my family's understanding of the word necessary. That knowledge is not heavy. It does not take up space in a car. But it changes the way you load everything else, carefully, with the attention of a person who understands that what she is taking is all there is, and there will not be a second trip. My mother stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, watching me carry boxes past her. She had the expression she wore when she believed a situation was being made more dramatic than it needed to be, a slight tightening around the eyes, a patience performed for an audience of 1. You're being dramatic, Nora. I'm being employed, I said. There's a difference. My father was on the couch watching a preseason game. He did not get up. You'll be back in a month, he said to the television. Mark my words. Was not home. He had switched to the evening shift, or he was avoiding the specific weight of the moment, or both. With the explanation and the avoidance were usually the same thing wearing different clothes. I loaded Biscuit and Pepper into the back seat. Fig went in her carrier on the passenger side, vocal and indignant, announcing her objections to the proceedings with the full commitment of a creature who had strong feelings about change and no reservations about expressing them. Then I went back inside one more time. My grandmother was in the garden deadheading the marigolds along the fence line, the ones that had survived the storm by some combination of root depth and the particular stubbornness of plants that have been well established for long enough to know what they can withstand. She looked up when she heard the screen door. I went to her. She held my face in both hands the way she had since I was small, her palms rough from 50 years of nursing and gardening, and the specific work of hands that are never idle, warm from the morning sun. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, as though reading something the others did not have access to. Call me every Sunday, she said, every Sunday without exception. Yes, ma'am. And fix the faucet in your new kitchen before the drip drives you sideways. I laughed, the real kind, the kind that arrives without permission. She tucked something into my jacket pocket, a sprig of dried sage from the herb bed, tied with kitchen string the pale color of old linen. For the new place, she said, sage survives anything. She said it the way she said things that were both practical advice and something larger. Not a metaphor exactly, but a truth that operated on more than one level simultaneously and trusted you to find the other levels on your own schedule. I hugged her. She held on a beat longer than usual. I'm going to fix this, she said into my shoulder. 3rd time she had said it. Same words. Different weight each time, as though the sentence was accumulating something, evidence, perhaps, or intention. I drove away without looking in the mirror. Not because I didn't want to look, but because I knew she would be standing at the garden gate watching, and I knew that if I saw that I would not be able to keep moving, and moving was what was required. The studio apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building on Elm Street in the next town over. $460 a month, pets allowed, leaky faucet in the kitchen bathroom, exposed brick in the main room that had looked charming in the listing and turned out to be genuinely charming in person, which was a surprise. I fixed the faucet the first night, quarter-turn valve, same repair I had watched my grandmother describe when she first called me over to fix hers, a year before the storm. The wrench echoed in the empty room because there was no furniture yet to absorb the sound. It felt, in the particular way of small necessary things done alone in empty rooms, like the beginning of something. The drip stopped. The silence that followed was the silence of a space that had been correctly attended to. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and the 3 animals arranged around me, and the yellow flashlight on the windowsill, because there was nowhere else to put it yet, and I breathed in the particular quiet of a place that was mine in a way no place had been mine before. Small, entirely mine. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. 3 years passed in the way that years pass when you are doing the right work and paying attention. I was promoted twice, lead electrician on residential jobs first, then commercial, then a crew of 4 on a retrofit project in a Victorian on Marsh Street that required 3 months of careful work and produced, at its completion, a satisfaction so specific and complete that I kept the job sheet in the glove box of my truck for a year after. I had a truck, a used one first, white, reliable, my name on a magnetic sign on the door that I had ordered from a print shop in, and applied myself in the parking lot on a Tuesday morning with the particular ceremony of a person marking something that matters. I called my grandmother every Sunday. She told me about the garden, her books, her neighbor who had beaten her at Scrabble twice in October, and whom she suspected of cheating though she could not prove it. She told me about the pipe under the kitchen sink, different fitting this time, she said, and I talked her through the repair over the phone while she was on her back under the cabinet, which she should not have been but was, because Ruth did not require permission to maintain her own house. She never mentioned the leather notebook. She never mentioned my parents. I did not ask. The Sunday calls had their own shape, their own rhythm, and that rhythm did not include my father or my mother, because including them would have changed the quality of the only hour each week that was purely between us. I understood this without it being said. My grandmother communicated a great deal without saying it directly, and I had been learning her language since I was small. What I did not know, what I would not know until the insurance letter arrived, was that in the hours between our Sunday calls, in the evenings on the porch with the leather notebook open on her knee, she was recording everything. Not just the garden schedules. Everything. The letter came to my old studio address, forwarded twice before it reached me. A white envelope, thin, with a blue logo in the corner I did not immediately recognize. Return address. Southeastern Mutual Insurance, Claims Division, Atlanta office. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter in my work boots, still carrying the smell of the commercial job I had been running all week, copper and solder flux, and the particular clean smell of new wiring installed correctly. Dear Ms., thank you for your participation in claim number 4471, B regarding hurricane damage to the property at 114 Marsh Road. This letter confirms the settlement of $44,000 dispersed to the primary policyholder, R. I read it again, then a third time, slower. I set the letter on the counter. I placed both hands flat on the surface because the floor felt uneven, though it was not. I stood that way for a while. I had never filed an insurance claim. I had never signed anything related to 114 Marsh Road. I had been 21 years old, sitting on the floor of a hallway closet with a dying phone and 3 animals while the roof demonstrated its flexibility. And the only document I had produced during that experience was a phone call to my grandmother at 9% battery. I called the insurance company. The representative was efficient, professional, and carefully unhelpful until I said, I need to see the claim form with my signature on it. It arrived by email 3 days later. There was my name, Nora Ellen, on a line that read, "Witness attestation. Confirms occupant was present and took reasonable measures to protect property during named storm event." The signature was not mine. It was close. Someone had practiced, or had a steady enough hand and enough familiarity with my handwriting from documents around the house to produce something that would pass a casual review. But I had been signing my name for 24 years, and I knew the particular way my capital N sat slightly forward, and the way the double L and ran together in a ligature I had developed in middle school. This was not that. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, simply because standing required more coordination than I currently had available. Fig came and sat beside me with the calm, assessing presence of a creature who has decided your distress is not dangerous but warrants company. $44,000. That was what my night in the dark had been worth to my father. Not my safety, not my presence, not the fact of a person sitting in a hallway closet counting the seconds between gusts and hopping the walls would hold. My signature. A forged version of it, produced after the fact, attached to a claim that had generated $44,000 deposited into an account with my father's name on it. I did not call my father. I did not call my mother. I picked up the phone and called my grandmother. She answered before the second ring completed. "I know," she said, before I had spoken a word. "Marshall already has the documents. We've been waiting for you to find the letter." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a great deal of information arriving simultaneously and requiring time to be organized into something I could respond to. "Who is Marshall?" I said. "My attorney," she said. "Marshall Raines. He has an office on Clement Street above the barber shop. He's been holding documents for me for 3 years." 3 years. Since October, 2 months after the storm. A page turned on her end of the line. She was reading while we talked, the way she always did when a conversation did not require her full visual attention. I suspected the claim immediately. I asked Marshall to pull the form through a public records request. "The signature isn't yours." We confirmed it. I looked at Fig beside me on the kitchen floor. She looked back with the steady, yellow-eyed patience of a creature who has been waiting for this conversation to finish so that the next thing can begin. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. "Because you needed to find it yourself," she said. "If I had told you, you would have acted from anger. Finding it yourself gives you something better." "What?" "Evidence with context." She turned another page. "You know what it cost. You know what night it came from. No one can take that knowledge away from you, Nora, because you arrived at it yourself." I sat with that. "Marshall," I said. "I should call him." "He's expecting you," she said. "He has been for 3 years." I drove to Clement Street the following Tuesday. Marshall Raines occupied the second floor of a brick building above a barber shop that smelled, from the stairwell, like aftershave and wood polish, and the accumulated scent of serious conversations held over many decades. His door had frosted glass with gold lettering, M. Raines, Esquire, Estate and Probate. He was 62, silver-haired, with reading glasses he adjusted each time he changed subjects, and a desk that held only a lamp, a coffee mug, and a manila envelope thick enough to prop a door. He shook my hand. He said he was sorry I had found the letter the way I did by post, forwarded twice, in work boots after a long day. "Your grandmother was the most deliberate woman I have worked with in 34 years of practice," he said, settling into his chair. "She came to see me 2 months after the storm. She brought fig preserves. She only brought gifts when she was about to ask for something complicated." He opened the manila envelope and slid a photocopy across the desk. A will, my grandmother's name at the top, dated 2 months after the storm. 2 witness signatures at the bottom, and a Pastor David Grimes, dated October 14th. The real property at 114 Marsh Road, Marshall said, reading the relevant clause without his glasses because he had read it enough times to know it from memory, including the land, structure, and all permanent fixtures, to pass solely and entirely to my granddaughter, Nora Ellen. I looked at the page. She changed it 2 months after the storm, I said. She had already been considering it, Marshall said. The storm clarified things. He adjusted his glasses. She was very specific about her language. She dictated several clauses herself. I have been practicing law for 34 years, and your grandmother's instructions were more precise than most attorneys' briefs. He slid a second document across the desk. The insurance claim form, my name on the witness line, the signature that was close but not mine. She obtained copies through the public records request, Marshall said. She suspected immediately. She asked me to verify. I did. He folded his hands on the desk. She knew about the forged signature before she came to me. That is why she came. I looked at the claim form, at the signature, at my name in someone else's rendering of my handwriting. Why didn't she report it? I said. Marshall took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, the gesture of a man who has been asked this question before and has thought carefully about the answer each time. She told me, he said, that if she went after directly would cut her off from you. She would lose both the house and her granddaughter in the same action. He put his glasses back on. She said, not yet. She said, when I'm gone, Nora will need this more than I do. The ceiling fan turned slowly. The room smelled like old coffee and the particular dry warmth of a space where paper has been kept for a long time. On the wall behind Marshall, a framed photograph showed him and my grandmother at what appeared to be a community event, both of them half smiling in the specific way of people who trust each other enough to skip the performance. She planned all of this, I said. She prepared for it, Marshall said. There is a difference. He said it the same way she said things, flat, precise, with the weight of a distinction that mattered. I drove home from Clement Street in the late afternoon light, with the photocopies on the passenger seat and Fig asleep in her carrier behind me, and the particular feeling of a person who has been handed a map to a territory she has been walking blind for 3 years. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. The specific, layered sensation of understanding arriving after confusion, which is never purely good because the understanding contains everything the confusion was protecting you from. $44,000, a forged signature, a will changed 2 months after the storm, a lawyer who had been holding documents for 3 years, and a leather notebook on a porch in the evenings, blue-black ink, left-handed slant, recording everything. My grandmother had not been waiting for things to get better on their own. She had been building. Quietly, methodically, across 3 years of Sunday phone calls and garden updates and Scrabble games with and fig preserves brought to a lawyer on Clement Street. She had been building a case with the precision of a woman who spent 40 years charting patient vitals and understood that the most important records are the ones kept before anyone thinks to ask for them. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building and sat with the engine off. I thought about the flashlight on my nightstand, about the palm against the rear window, about the voice that said I'm going to fix this 3 times in 3 different registers, panic, then decision, then plan. She had meant it the 3rd time most specifically. And the fix, I now understood, had been in progress since October 14th, 3 years ago, in an office above a barber shop on Clement Street, witnessed by a pastor named David Grimes, signed in blue-black ink in the left-handed forward-leaning slant of a woman who had decided that some things needed to be made permanent before the people who might contest them had the chance. I picked up my phone. I called her. She answered on the 2nd ring, mid-sentence with someone else, switched over with the clean efficiency of a woman who managed multiple conversations the way she managed multiple plants. each one attended to in its own time without neglecting the others. Marshall gave me the documents, I said. Good, she said. How are you feeling? I thought about the question. Like I've been reading the wrong blueprint, I said. A pause. Then the sound of her setting something down. A mug, probably the one with the cardinal on it that she had used every morning for 20 years. You were reading the only one they showed you, she said. Now you have the full set. She was right. I had the full set now. The will, the insurance documents, the forged signature, the 3 years of recorded evidence in a notebook I had not yet read but knew existed. The full architectural drawing of what she had built and why and for whom. What I did not have yet was the notebook itself. She would give it to me at Christmas. She would pull it from under her chair on the back porch while the sage stayed green in the dormant garden, and the December light went amber over the herb beds, and she would tell me one more thing I was not ready to hear. But that was 3 months away. First there was my mother's phone call, and the lunch at the diner, and call about my father visiting with a folder, and the slow, deliberate campaign my father ran in the spaces where my grandmother's reputation lived. The hardware store, the church breakfast, the careful comments dropped like seeds in the particular soil of a small town where things grow whether or not you intend to tend them. My father was building a different kind of case, and my grandmother, on the same porch in the same evenings, was building the one that would outlast his. My mother called on a Wednesday. That alone should have told me something. Did not make midweek phone calls unless a specific need had generated them. Her communication followed a pattern I had mapped over 21 years, birthdays, because the calendar prompted her holidays, because the occasion excused the reach, and favors, because something had run out or gone wrong and I was the next available option. Midweek calls in the middle of March were not in the pattern. I was thinking we could have lunch, she said. Her voice carried a warmth I recognized from my childhood as the voice she used when she wanted something and had decided that warmth was the correct instrument for getting it. It sounded almost exactly like the real thing. Almost. Lunch, I said. The diner on Orchard. Saturday, my treat. I should have said no. Marshall's documents were still on my kitchen table. The will, the insurance form, the forged signature. The manila envelope had been sitting there for 2 weeks while I decided what to do next, and in the meantime looked at it every morning while I made coffee, the way you look at something that has changed the floor plan of a space you thought you knew. I knew what my father had done. I knew what my mother had allowed by getting in the car and driving away. But there is a thing that happens when the person who hurt you offers a crumb of what you have been hungry for since childhood. The hunger does not consult the evidence. It simply reaches. I said yes. The diner smelled like industrial coffee and apple pie, and the particular warmth of a space that has been feeding people for decades, and has absorbed the accumulated smell of all those meals into its walls and booths, and the laminate surface of its counter. My mother was already in a booth by the window. When I arrived, napkin in her lap, menu untouched, her reading glasses pushed up on her head in the way she wore them when she wanted to appear relaxed. She stood when she saw me and hugged me briefly, carefully, the hug of a person uncertain of their reception, arms going around and releasing before the other person has fully committed. You look good, she said, strong. I carry wire and conduit for a living, I said. She almost laughed. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I had been waiting for since I was approximately 6 years old, the expression of a person arriving at a reckoning they had been postponing. I should have stayed with you that night, Nora. Her voice was careful, each word placed deliberately. During the storm, I should have fought harder. My chest tightened with the specific tightening of someone who wants very badly to believe what they are hearing, and has enough evidence to know they should not trust the wanting. We ordered. She asked about my apartment, my work, biscuit and pepper and fig. She said that's wonderful 4 times in the spaces where a person who is paying attention would have said something more specific. She asked about a scar on my right hand, a burn from a wire connection that had gone wrong in January, healed now but still visible. The first time she had ever noticed a mark on my body that I had not pointed out myself. Then, between her second cup of coffee and the arrival of the check, she picked up her spoon and stirred. 1, 2, 3. She always stirred 3 times when she was approaching the thing she actually wanted to say, not toward it directly, but circling it the way you circle a drain, orbiting the center without committing to it. Your grandmother has been looking so tired lately. 3 stirs, spoon set down, eyes on the coffee rather than on me. I worry about her. Have you talked to her much about the house or anything like that? I looked at my mother across the diner table, 52 years old, reading glasses on her head, a question she was trying to make sound like concern. She was not apologizing. She was gathering information. She had come to find out what I knew and what my grandmother had told me, dressed in the language of a mother reconnecting with a daughter, and the costume was good enough that if I had not been sitting across from Marshall's documents for 2 weeks, I might have let it work. We talk about her garden mostly, I said. My mother nodded slowly, absorbing, filing. The check came. She paid. She hugged me again at the door, longer this time, as though measuring something in the duration. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 12 minutes with the engine off and my hands on the wheel. The pie had been good. The conversation had been a performance, not a cruel one, not without genuine feeling underneath it, but a performance nonetheless. My mother did love me in her way. The problem was never the love. The problem was what she did when the love conflicted with what my father wanted, and what she consistently chose in that conflict, and what I had finally stopped pretending to misunderstand. I drove home. I put the manila envelope in the kitchen drawer. I called my grandmother. She asked about the house, I said. I know, she said. Sent her. A page turned. He's getting anxious. That means we're closer than he thinks. Called on a Tuesday. Was 59, retired from the postal service, and had lived next door to my grandmother for 38 years in the specific way of neighbors who have graduated from proximity into something more essential. The person who has the spare key, who notices when the mail isn't collected, who calls the right people before the wrong ones find out first. Her voice had the quality of a woman who delivered information the way she had delivered mail, steadily, without drama, in the correct order. Your father's been coming around, she said, 3 times this week. He sits at Ruth's kitchen table with a folder. I was at my own kitchen table, second cup of coffee, Fig on the chair across from me in the particular supervisory posture she adopted when she wanted to appear involved. What kind of folder? I heard him through the screen door on Tuesday. Paused. He's asking her to add his name to the property deed. For tax purposes, he says. He'd handle the maintenance, the roof work, the foundation, things she can't manage alone at her age. All she has to do is sign. I set my coffee down. What did she say? No's voice carried a warmth of appreciation for this. 3 times. Polite each time. But no. Ruth has been saying no to things she doesn't want for 73 years, and she has not gotten less efficient at it. That should have been sufficient. My father presenting a folder and my grandmother saying no 3 times should have been the end of it. The way a door closes when the person behind it does not want it open. Did not hear no. He heard not yet. What he did next was quieter and considerably uglier than a folder on a kitchen table. Called again the following week. Her voice had a different quality this time. The voice of a person reporting something that has been making her angry and that she has been deciding whether to say. He's been talking around town, she said. The hardware store on Clement. The church breakfast on Thursday mornings. Nothing direct, just comments. Ruth's been forgetting things lately. She left the stove on. We worry about her. It's hard to watch. Exhaled. None of it true, Nora, not a word. I knew this without being told. My grandmother's mind was as clear as it had been at any point in my life. Clearer, perhaps, than most minds at any age. The specific clarity of a person who has spent decades developing precision as a practice rather than an aspiration. She managed her own finances, her own medications, her own tax returns. She read 2 novels a week and could recite the Latin name of every plant in her garden and beat at Scrabble on alternate Thursdays, and had, 3 years ago, walked into Marshall's office with fig preserves and the clearest instructions he had received in 34 years of practice. But reputation in a small town operates the way mold operates. It spreads in the dark, in the spaces where light doesn't reach, and by the time you notice it, the damage is already structural. My father was hanging wallpaper, one careful, casual, entirely deniable conversation at a time. "Is she worried?" I asked. Your grandmother made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She told me, is getting desperate. That means we're close. The sound again. She was reading while she said it, didn't even look up from the page. I called my grandmother that evening. She picked up mid-sentence with someone else, probably, or the pastor, switched over cleanly and said, "He filed a variance request with the county assessor's office last week. He's trying to establish a maintenance claim on the property. Marshall already has the response prepared." How long has Marshall had a response prepared? 3 weeks. A page turned. We anticipated this. Grandma. Yes. How many steps ahead are you? A pause that contained something that might have been satisfaction, if she had been a person who expressed satisfaction. Enough, she said. I went home for Christmas. The house smelled the way it always smelled in December. Pine from the wreath on the front door, cinnamon from something on the stove, and underneath everything the permanent foundational smell of a house that has been lived in by the same person for decades. Old wood, lemon oil, lavender from the sachets she kept in every drawer and closet. These smells were so specifically hers that walking through the front door each December felt less like arriving at a place, and more like being received by a person. The house itself extending the same welcome its owner always extended, unhurried and complete. We sat on the back porch with tea. The garden was dormant, brown stems and winter mulch and the bare stalks of the marigolds along the fence line. But the sage was still green. It always was. It did not ask permission to keep living through cold it hadn't chosen. My grandmother had the leather notebook in her lap. She had brought it out to the porch without mentioning it, the way she brought things she intended to discuss, setting the object in proximity and letting the conversation arrive at it in its own time. I had not seen the notebook in years. The cover was darker now, softer with handling, its leather acquiring the patina of something that had been carried close and opened often. She looked at the dormant garden for a long time before she spoke. I was not a warm mother, she said. I've told you that before, but I need you to understand it now more precisely than you have before. I waited. My grandmother did not repeat herself and did not elaborate unless she intended to. Your mother was a child who needed praise, she said. I believed praise should be earned specifically and measurably. I was a fair mother, but fair isn't warm and wanted warm. She sipped her tea. She married your father because he told her every day out loud that she was exceptional. I never told her that. So when she had to choose between his voice and mine, she chose his. I created the silence she was trying to fill. I can't blame her entirely for filling it. The winter wind moved through the bare herb beds. Dead leaves scraped across the porch boards in a thin, dry whisper. Understanding someone, she said, is not the same as excusing them. Don't hate your mother, Nora, but don't trust her either. There's a difference between the two, and knowing the difference will matter. She reached under her chair and brought out the leather notebook. She set it on the table between us. The rubber band holding it shut was the same one, or one like it, worn, dark with handling. "When the time comes," she said, "give this to Marshall. He'll know what to do with it." "What time?" She looked at me. Her eyes were clear, entirely present, the specific clarity of a person who has finished what needed finishing and is at peace with the timeline. "I'm 78 years old, sweetheart." She said it simply, without self-pity or drama. "The time comes whether you name it or not." I took the notebook. It was heavier than I expected, dense with pages, with years, with everything she had been recording in that left-handed forward-leaning slant since the October morning 2 months after the storm, when she had walked into Marshall's office with fig preserves, and a set of instructions, so precise, he had been adjusting his professional standards upward ever since. At the front door, she hugged me longer than usual. I could feel her collarbones through her cardigan. "You are the best thing I ever did right," she said, "even if I arrived at it late." I drove home with the notebook on the passenger seat. I did not open it. Not then. She had said when the time comes, and I understood, with the specific understanding of a person who has learned a language by immersion, that the time she meant was not yet. I put it on my bookshelf, beside the yellow flashlight, which I had moved there the week I unpacked properly, not because I needed either of them where I could see them, but because some objects earn a visible place by what they survived. I called her every Sunday. The calls were the same: the garden, her books, Scrabble strategies, the Victorian retrofit I was running on Hawthorne Street. She never mentioned the notebook. She never mentioned my father's variance request, which Marshall had responded to with a document that apparently made the county assessor's office very clear on the subject of who owned 114 Marsh Road, and on what basis. She sounded, on every Sunday call, like a woman who had completed something large, and was now in the period of simply living while the completed thing did its work. Marshall called on a Tuesday in February. I was under a kitchen sink in a duplex on the east side, replacing a P-trap when my phone buzzed in my front pocket. I let it go. He called again before I had finished wiping my hands. I slid out from under the cabinet. I answered. His voice was the same, measured, precise, but carrying something it had not carried before. A weight that changed the texture of the words the way weather changes the texture of air. "It's Nora," I said automatically. A pause. "Yes, I'm sorry. Nora," another pause. "Your grandmother passed this morning in her sleep. Found her." I sat on the kitchen floor of a stranger's duplex and looked at the underside of the cabinet. A spider had built something elaborate between the P-trap and the drain pipe, the web catching the light from my work lamp in a way that made it briefly, absurdly beautiful. The disposal hummed faintly because I had not finished disconnecting the power. "Nora, are you there?" "I'm here." "I wanted you to hear it from me first, before anyone else." Marshall understood the hierarchy. He had understood it for 5 years, since the morning my grandmother walked into his office with fig preserves and changed her will, and told him in precise, specific language who should hear things first and why the order mattered. I drove to the house, was on the porch with a glass of water she was not drinking, her eyes red in the specific way of eyes that have been crying for several hours and have temporarily exhausted the mechanism. She had let herself in with the spare key my grandmother had given her years ago. Just in case, my grandmother had said, with the practicality of a woman who prepared for everything that could be prepared for. My grandmother was in her bed, the covers pulled up to her shoulders, one hand resting on a closed book, the Florence Nightingale biography she had mentioned on our last Sunday call. The room smelled like peppermint and beeswax. The curtains were the lace ones she had kept since before I was born. The morning light came through them and lay across the bed in a soft pattern. I sat in the chair beside the bed. I did not cry immediately. The feeling was too large for crying. It filled every space and left no room for anything to escape through the ordinary channels. I sat with it the way she had taught me to sit with large things, fully, without rushing the next part. The leather notebook was on the nightstand beside a glass of water with a pencil resting across the rim. Her reading glasses. The small alarm clock she had kept for 40 years that ran 3 minutes fast and that she had never adjusted because, she said, it was good to be slightly ahead of the hour. It was, I thought, the most complete summary of her I had ever seen in a single nightstand. I love you more, I said, and longer. The curtain moved in the draft. 2 hours later, my father called. Your grandmother left some paperwork, he said. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the 11 hours since she had been found. We need to sort the house situation. When's a good time? Not, I'm sorry for your loss. Not, are you all right? Not, she was a good woman. Straight to the paperwork, straight to the house. My mother called 30 minutes after that. I'm devastated, she said. I believed her about that one part. Has anyone mentioned anything about a will? I looked at the leather notebook on the nightstand, at the glass of water, at the pencil across the rim. Not yet, I said. That night, I opened the notebook for the first time. Ruth wrote the way she spoke, clean, direct, precise, without a wasted word. The entries were dated, each one beginning with a number and a month in blue-black ink, left-handed slant, the letters leaning forward as though they were in a hurry to arrive somewhere that mattered. She had recorded everything. September 15th. Boarded Nora's window from outside. I was in car. I could not stop it. September 15th. 11:40 p.m. Nora called from the closet. She was calm. I was not. September 18th. Inspected the house on return. Said, house looks good. Did not speak to Nora directly for 40 minutes. I counted. She had counted. She had been counting while my father checked the baseboards and my mother commented on the smell. She had been in the kitchen counting the seconds of silence the way I had been counting them, and she had written it down that same evening. October 3rd. Filed insurance claim. Told the adjuster an occupant was present during the storm event. Used Nora's name without her knowledge. October 8th. Asked Marshall to pull the claim form through public records. The signature is not Nora's. The capital N sits flat. Hers leans forward. Someone practiced but did not know her well enough. October 14th. Newell signed, and Pastor Grimes witnessed. Marshall filed with the county clerk by end of business. The entries continued. Visits from my father with his folder. My mother's lunch and the 3 stirs of the coffee spoon. The hardware store conversations, recorded secondhand through, given dates and names. The variance request and Marshall's response. The Sunday phone calls brief notations, a line each but present. Every Sunday accounted for. Sunday, Nora called. She's running a retrofit on Hawthorne Street, Victorian. She said the original wiring was a disaster. She sounded pleased. Sunday, Nora called. We talked about copper versus PEX for 20 minutes. She knows more than she thinks she does. She always has. I read them all. Entry after entry across 5 years of blue-black ink, left-handed slant. A woman at a porch table in the evenings recording what she witnessed with the precision of someone who understood that the most important records are the ones made before anyone thinks to ask for them. The last dated entry was from 3 weeks before she died. February 10th. I am tired, but the notebook is finished. Marshall has what he needs. Nora has what she'll need when the time comes. I did not do this out of anger. I want to be clear about that in case anyone reads this and believes otherwise. I did it because someone needed to be counting and nobody was, so I counted. On the final page, folded once and tucked between the cardboard backing and the leather cover, was a letter. Same ink, same slant. Dear Nora, you deserved better. Now you'll have it. Don't be kind to people who weren't kind to you. Be fair. There is a difference. Kindness can be performed. Fairness requires evidence. I have given you the evidence. The house is yours. Not because you earned it, you did, but that is not the reason. It is yours because I trust you with what I could not protect while I was alive. I am sorry it took me this long. I love you more and longer. Grandma Ruth. I read the letter 4 times. The 4th time I understood the distinction she was making. Be fair, not be kind, with the specific understanding of a person who has been kind to people who did not deserve it for long enough to know the cost. Kindness can be performed. Fairness requires evidence. She had given me the evidence. I picked up the phone. I called Marshall. I'm ready, I said. Good, he said. Wear comfortable shoes. These things can take a while. How long have you been waiting for that call? A pause. Brief. The pause of a man choosing between the professional answer and the true one. 5 years, he said, but your grandmother assured me it would be worth it. He was right. She always was. I need to stop here. If you have ever had someone in your life who was counting when nobody else was, who was writing it down, building the case, holding the evidence until you were ready for it, leave me a comment and tell me their name. I read every single one. Because what happens in Marshall's office when my father sits down across the table and hears what my grandmother put in that will, I have been thinking about how to tell it for a long time. Stay with me. We are almost there. The calls began on a Tuesday evening. Marshall had sent the formal notices by certified mail the previous Thursday. Return receipt requested. Delivered to my father's contracting address and my mother's phone number, and studio on the east side of. 3 envelopes, 3 signatures required on delivery. Marshall had told me this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that the method of notification was itself a form of documentation. My father signed for his at 11:14 Thursday morning. I know because Marshall emailed me the confirmation. The first call came Tuesday at 7:42 in the evening while I was washing dishes after dinner. His number on the screen. I dried my hands. I let it ring through to voicemail. He did not leave one. He called again at 8:16, 8:50, 9:31. Each time the phone rang with the specific urgency of a call that believes its own importance. That insistent, slightly too long ring of a person who has decided that the failure to answer is a problem the other person is creating rather than a choice being made. I washed the dishes. I fed the animals. I read for an hour. I went to bed. He had called 9 times by midnight. The 10 calls from my number in the week after the storm, the ones I had made from the closet at 9% battery, one of which he had not answered, had accumulated 9 additional calls in the 7 years since, none of which he had returned. We were, by midnight Tuesday, approximately even. Wednesday morning at 6:14, his number appeared again. This time I was awake. I had been lying in bed listening to Biscuit's breathing, which had developed a slight catch in it that the vet had told me to monitor, the particular sound of a dog entering his final years with the uncomplaining dignity that dogs bring to everything. I looked at the screen. I answered. Nora, he caught himself. The fact that he had to catch himself, that after 28 years his first instinct was still the wrong name, registered somewhere below thought, in the place where things are noted without being processed. I need to talk to you before this goes any further. Okay. Marshall is making this into something it doesn't need to be. Your grandmother, she was elderly, Nora. She wasn't always thinking clearly at the end. Whatever he told you she wanted, I can tell you from living with her for 13 years that the will doesn't reflect. She had a capacity evaluation from her physician 3 days before she signed it, I said. Marshall has the documentation. A silence, brief, the silence of a man whose argument has met its counter before he finished making it. I'm your father, he said, as though this were a relevant fact in the current context, as though the relationship itself were a form of argument, a trump card that superseded documentation and forged signatures, and 4 screws in a window frame. "I know," I said. "Don't make me the bad guy here." I looked at the ceiling. The water stain in the corner where the upstairs neighbor's bathroom leaked. I had offered to fix it twice, and twice he had declined, preferring the slow damage to the disruption of repair. Some people would rather live with the leak than let someone under the sink. "I'm not making you anything," I said. "I'm just not answering the phone." "That's what I mean. You're not even." "I'll see you at the reading, Dad." I hung up. He called 4 more times across Wednesday and Thursday. I did not answer. He left 2 voicemails, the first composed and strategic, the second less so, the composure thinning in the way composure thins when it is performing rather than genuine, and the performance is not producing the desired result. The second voicemail said, near its end, in a voice that had lost most of its careful modulation, "Everything I did was for this family. Everything. And you're going to stand there and let a lawyer take it apart because of what? Because of one night, one storm." I listened to it once. Then I called Marshall. He left a voicemail, I said. "Save it," Marshall said. "Don't delete anything." My mother called on Thursday evening. I was at the kitchen table with the documents spread in front of me. The will, the insurance form, the notebook entries Marshall had prepared as supporting documentation, his card in the upper right corner of the stack like a bookmark. I had been sitting with them for an hour, not reviewing them exactly, not needing to review them since I had read them enough times that their contents had become part of my working knowledge. Simply sitting with them, the way you sit with something that is about to change the shape of things, and that deserves, before it does, a moment of full acknowledgement. My mother's number appeared on my phone. I answered. She was crying before she spoke, not the smooth, controlled crying she produced when she wanted an effect, but the rougher, stuttering kind that arrives when the mechanism is genuinely engaged rather than deliberately deployed. The difference was audible. I had 28 years of data on the subject. "If you take that house," she said, "you're taking everything your father has left. We have been in that house for 13 years, Nora. Where are we supposed to go?" I stood at the kitchen window. The radiator ticked its irregular rhythm. Outside, the streetlight buzzed with a loose filament, its light slightly unsteady, a warm amber that fell across the wet pavement in a pool that shifted when the wind moved. "Mom," I said, "you lived in Grandma's house for 13 years without paying rent." "It was our home." "It was her home. She let you stay. That's a different thing." "That's not how family works." "It's exactly how property law works." She cried harder. I stood at the window and let the silence stretch between us, not cruelly, not as punishment, but because there was nothing to say that was both true and kind, and I had decided, after 4 readings of my grandmother's letter, to stop choosing one of those at the expense of the other. The old part of me, the part that used to pull the folding chair from the hall closet without being asked, that used to be grateful for any acknowledgement that took longer than 3 stirs of a coffee spoon, that part wanted to say it was all right, that we would figure something out, that I was not trying to hurt anyone. I thought about the whiteboard. Car 1, Car 2, no column for Nora. I thought about 4 screws going into a window frame, while the sky went green at the edges and yellow in the center, and every bird on Marsh Road went silent. I thought about my grandmother in the back seat of my mother's car, pressing her palm against the rear window. "I'll see you at the reading, Mom," I said. I hung up. Pepper put his head on my foot. He was gray around the muzzle now, moving slowly on cold mornings, the particular slowing of an old dog who has decided that pace is less important than presence. I reached down and scratched behind his ear. He closed his eyes. The radiator ticked. The streetlight buzzed. The documents on the table sat in their stack with Marshall's card at the corner, patient, and complete. Everything my grandmother had built across 5 years of blue-black ink waiting for Monday morning at 10 o'clock in a room above a barber shop on Clement Street. Called on Friday morning. Her voice had a different quality than usual, a careful steadiness. The voice of a person who has decided to say something they have been holding for a long time and has organized their courage around the decision. She called at 8:17. I was on my second coffee, sitting at the table with the documents still spread from the night before and the yellow flashlight on the bookshelf visible in my peripheral vision. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I should have said it years ago and I didn't. That's on me, and I want you to know I understand that before I say what I have to say." I set the coffee down. "Okay." "The morning of the storm," she said. "I went out to check my shutters at 6:30, 6:40. I saw your father at your bedroom window with the plywood and the drill. The kitchen was very quiet. I watched him position the board. I watched him drive the screws. Her voice was steady but working to be 4 of them. I counted. I heard him say something through the wood before he walked away. I couldn't make out the words from my yard, but the way he said it," she stopped. Started again. Like he was talking to something he had decided wasn't worth looking at. I looked at the window above my kitchen sink. The morning light was coming through it in the flat, pale way of a February morning that has not decided what kind of day it intends to be. "You saw him," I said. "I saw him, and I went back inside." Her voice cracked briefly, then steadied. "I told myself it wasn't my family. It wasn't my business. I have been sick about it ever since." "Why now?" She was quiet for a moment. "The funeral," she said. "Your father shook my hand outside the church and said, 'Well, at least we can finally sort out the house.' That was what he said. At Ruth's funeral, at my best friend's funeral, a breath. I went home and called Marshall." "Are you coming to the reading?" I said. "I'm one of the witnesses," she said. "Marshall already confirmed it. Wild horses, sweetheart." After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. I thought about on her porch at 6:40 in the morning, watching, counting 4 screws, then going back inside. The decision she made to call it someone else's business. The 5 years of sitting with that decision. I had spent a long time, over the years, understanding how people stand at windows and watch things they could intervene in and do not. The calculation they make, it's not my family, not my window, not my place to say. The way that calculation feels in the moment, like a reasonable boundary, and feels, in the years after, like something else entirely. But had come back. Late, carrying 5 years of having not spoken. And she had come back anyway. There is something that needs to be said about the people who come back late. Not that it erases the years. It doesn't. And pretending otherwise would be the kind of kindness my grandmother had specifically instructed me to distinguish from fairness. But late is better than silent. Late, when it carries the full weight of knowing it is late and coming anyway, is its own kind of courage. I thought my grandmother would have agreed with that. I thought of the notebook entry from September 15th, the second one, written at 11:40 at night. Nora called from the closet. She was calm, I was not. She had been not calm. She had been on the phone in a hotel room with the television on low, the weathercast listing wind speeds in a voice like a grocery list, and she had been not calm. And she had been building the response to her not calm since October 14th, across 5 years, in blue-black ink. She had not been able to stop what happened in that window frame. But she had counted every screw. Sunday night. The reading was Monday at 10 in the morning. I spread everything across the kitchen table one final time, not to review, not to prepare additional arguments, but in the way you lay out what you have before a significant morning to confirm that it is what it is and that it is enough. The will, printed on heavy paper in Marshall's office, 2 witness signatures at the bottom in the handwriting I now knew well. The insurance documents, claim number 4471B, the forged signature on the witness line with the flat capital N that was not mine. The notebook entries, the relevant ones, Marshall had said, though I would bring the notebook itself just in case. His card at the corner of the stack. A legal pad on which I had written nothing, because there was nothing left to plan. Moth Fig. I had been calling her Fig since she was a kitten, but she had recently made clear that she preferred the windowsill to my lap, and the name Moth suited this new configuration of her personality better. Sat on the notebook as cats sit on things, with the particular authority of a creature who has identified the most important object in the room and claimed it. I let her stay. Biscuit was on his bed by the radiator. He was 10 now, the catch in his breathing more pronounced in cold weather, his movements careful and deliberate in the way of old dogs who have learned which expenditures of energy are worth the cost. He had been with me since before the storm, since I was 17, and found him outside the diner on Orchard Street on a January morning, shaking, and carried him inside and fed him a piece of toast, and called no one because there was no one to call who would have helped me keep him. He had been with me through the storm, through 3 apartments, through the truck and the magnetic sign and the commercial retrofit on the Victorian, through the insurance letter forwarded twice to the wrong address, through every Sunday call and every notebook entry and every version of the story I had been trying to understand for 7 years. You did fine, I told him. He opened one eye, closed it. The yellow flashlight sat on the bookshelf above the television where it had always sat, since the first night in the first apartment. I had changed the batteries once in 7 years. It still worked, the same wide, steady beam, the same warm yellow light that my grandmother had chosen specifically, because she knew what she was giving me and had selected accordingly. I picked it up. I turned it on and pointed it at the ceiling. The beam was exactly what it had always been, steady, wide, the light of a thing built to be reliable in conditions that required reliability. I turned it off. I set it back on the shelf. I had been thinking, all week, about a question that kept circling without landing. Was I doing this because my grandmother wanted me to, or because I needed to for myself? The answer came in her voice, the version I carried. Both are true, it said. Both have always been true. That is not a conflict. I called Marshall at 9:15. Anything I should know, I said. Wear comfortable shoes. A pause, and bring the notebook. Just in case of what? In case your father argues the will was drafted under duress. The notebook is Ruth's own record, dated entries, her handwriting, her hand. It won't carry legal weight as evidence, but it will carry something else. What? Moral standing, he said. Moral standing is what changes the quality of air in a room. Your grandmother understood that. She understood it better than most attorneys I have worked with. I set the phone down. I looked at the table, the documents, Marshall's card, the notebook with moth displaced from it now and sitting on the legal pad instead, which she considered an acceptable compromise. I gathered everything carefully. The will on top, the insurance documents beneath it, the notebook last, wrapped in the dish towel from the oven handle, because it was the closest thing to a cover I had, and my grandmother's notebook deserved to be carried with something between it and the world. I turned off the kitchen light. The apartment went dark, not sealed dark, not storm dark. The streetlight outside laid its amber stripe across the floor through the gap in the curtain, warm and steady. The radiator ticked. Biscuit breathed his slow, catching breath. Moth settled more firmly on the legal pad. The last time I sat in the dark, someone else decided when the lights went out, and when they would come back on, and whether I would be left with enough battery to call the one person who was counting. This time I turned off the light myself. I chose the dark. I would choose the light in the morning. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. I went to bed at 10. I set the alarm for 7. I lay in the dark and listened to the apartment, biscuit's breath, the radiator, the street outside beginning its quiet Sunday night withdrawal from the day. I thought about my grandmother on this same Sunday night 5 years ago, sitting at her kitchen table in the house on Marsh Road, writing in blue-black ink. October 14th, Newell signed, and Pastor Grimes witnessed. Marshall filed with the county clerk by end of business. She had written that, and closed the notebook and gone to bed. And in the morning she had called me, and I had not known yet, and we had talked about the garden and Scrabble strategies and the weather in, and she had said at the end, as she always said, "I love you more." And longer, I had said. I thought about that call, about every Sunday call across 5 years, each one recorded in the notebook in a single line, Sunday. Nora called. She sounded pleased. While underneath the calls, in the evenings on the porch, she was building what she was building with the specific patience of a woman who understood that the most important things take the longest, and that the length of time required is not a problem with the plan but a feature of it. She had been patient for 5 years. I could be patient for one night. I closed my eyes. I slept not long, not deeply, but I slept. The first sleep in a week that was not interrupted by the specific wakeful alertness of a person waiting for something. The something was tomorrow. Tomorrow was arranged. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. My grandmother had seen to that. All that remained was the morning and the room and the comfortable shoes, and whatever quality of air a leather notebook, and a forged insurance signature, and a will witnessed by and Pastor David Grimes could produce in a room above a barber shop on Clement Street. I thought that quality of air was going to be quite significant. I thought my grandmother would have agreed. I thought she was, in whatever sense a person persists after they are gone, in the notebook, in the flashlight, in the sage that survived the storm and the winter and the summer drought because sage does not ask permission to keep living. I thought she was, in all of those senses, looking forward to Monday morning at 10 o'clock. As was I. As was Marshall, who had been waiting in his office above the barber shop, with his reading glasses and his manila envelopes and his 34 years of practice, for 5 years. As was, who was going to walk into that room with 38 years of friendship and 4 counted screws and the specific courage of a person who came back late but came back. As was my grandmother's will, sitting in Marshall's dark green folder, printed on heavy paper in the font she had. She had the font. Marshall had told me with a smile that was the closest thing to astonishment I had seen on his face. Waiting to be read aloud in a room where everyone who needed to hear it would be present, and no one who needed to hear it would be able to leave before the reading was complete. She had thought of everything. She always had. Marshall's office looked different on a Monday morning. The same frosted glass door, the same gold lettering, the same stairwell smelling of aftershave and old wood, and the accumulated weight of serious conversations held over many decades. But the morning light came through the east-facing window at an angle that did not exist on Tuesday afternoons, and that angle caught the frosted glass and threw patterns across the hallway floor that I had not seen before, precise, shifting shapes, like the light was doing something specific and intentional with the surface it had been given. My grandmother would have had a name for the phenomenon. She had names for most things. I arrived at 8:51, 9 minutes early, my father's habit, or rather the habit I had developed from watching my father's habits, and then kept without entirely realizing it was his. The way you keep things from people you love imperfectly, because the thing itself is good even when the person wasn't always. The barbershop below was closed on Mondays. The building was quiet except for the clock on Marshall's wall, audible through the door. A steady, unhurried tick that made each second feel accounted for. Was already in the waiting area when I arrived, sitting in the chair nearest the window with her purse held in both hands and her blue cardigan buttoned to the top against a cold she had decided to dress for rather than merely endure. She stood when she saw me. She hugged me without speaking. I hugged her back. We held on for a moment in the quiet hallway above the closed barber shop while the clock ticked and the light moved on the floor. "Your grandmother would have been pleased," she said into my shoulder. "She planned it," I said. "She would have been satisfied. That's different." Made the sound, the not quite laugh, the sound of a person recognizing truth and appreciating its precision. "That's exactly right," she said. "Satisfied. That's exactly the word she would have used." Marshall opened his door. He shook my hand. He showed us in. The conference room was rectangular, 6 chairs around a table of dark wood, a fluorescent light overhead that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of annoyance. A clock on the wall that ticked in the same register as the one in Marshall's office. Perhaps the same manufacturer, perhaps simply the same quality of attention to keeping time. On the table, Marshall's dark green folder, thicker than the one I had seen on my previous visit, a glass of water at each place, a box of tissues at the far end that had been placed there with the specific foresight of a man who had run enough of these rooms to know what they required. I set the notebook on the table in front of me, still wrapped in the dish towel, looked at it and then looked away, her jaw doing the thing jaws do when a person is holding something in. My father arrived at 9:58. 2 minutes early, his habit, the original one, the one I had borrowed without knowing. He was wearing a sport coat I had not seen before, dark navy, and shoes that had been recently polished, the leather catching the overhead light with the particular shine of something attended to that morning with deliberate care. He looked, entering the room, like a man who had decided that appearance was still a form of argument and had dressed accordingly. He saw me. He saw the notebook on the table. Something moved across his face, not recognition exactly, because he did not know what was in the notebook, but awareness. The awareness of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when an object on a table means something. He sat across from me. He placed both hands flat on the table, fingers spread, palms down. A man claiming the surface available to him. "Nora," he said, a greeting that was also an assessment. "Dad," I said. My mother came in 30 seconds behind him. She had not slept. The evidence was in her eyes and in her blouse, which was buttoned one hole off so the whole thing sat slightly crooked, the collar tilting left. She sat beside my father without speaking. She looked at the notebook on the table. She looked at me. She did not look at. Arrived last, 4 minutes past 10. He wore a wrinkled button-down and jeans and took the chair at the far end of the table, as far from everyone as the room's geometry allowed. He looked at his hands when he sat down. He had been looking at his hands, I thought, since the morning of the storm when he sat in the passenger seat with his earbuds in and did not wave. My father looked at. "Why is she here?" "Mrs. is a witness to the will," Marshall said, without looking up from his folder. "She is present in her capacity as signatory." I wasn't told there would be witnesses present. There are always witnesses present at a will reading where the will has been signed by witnesses. Marshall looked up. "That is what the word witness means, mister." My father's jaw shifted. He rearranged his hands on the table, the same palms down position, but recalibrated, the way a person adjusts their weight when the floor turns out to be less solid than they assumed. Marshall opened the dark green folder. He arranged the documents in front of himself with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this many times and understands that the arrangement of documents before a reading is itself a form of communication, that the order things are placed in tells the room something about what is coming before anything is said. He put on his reading glasses. He looked at no one. "This is the last will and testament of Ruth," he said. "Dated October 14th, 5 years prior. Witnessed by Constance Mary and Reverend David Grimes. notarized and filed with the county clerk by end of business on the date of signing. He read the preamble, the legal language of wills, the declarations of sound mind and clear intention, the nomming of the attorney and the nomming of the estate. My grandmother's full name, her address, the date. The language was formal and dry in the way of documents that have been designed to be unassailable rather than readable. And Marshall read it with the measured authority of a man who understood that the formality was protective, that every clause was a wall, and the walls had been built by my grandmother herself, with Marshall's assistance and 34 years of his experience, to be exactly as strong as they needed to be. My father sat with his hands on the table. His face was composed. He had decided, I thought, on a strategy of apparent calm, the presentation of a man who had come to a legal proceeding and had every reason to be confident of its outcome. The sport coat, the polished shoes, the palms flat and the fingers spread, claiming the surface. The preamble concluded. Marshall turned the page. The following specific bequests are made from the personal property of the estate. He read the list. My grandmother's car to my mother, the old sedan, 17 years old, still running because she had maintained it with the same attention she brought to everything. Her collection of nursing texts to the county library, to be held in the reference section. Her garden tools, labeled individually with the name of the person she intended to receive them, to her neighbors on Marsh Road, including who received the good pruning shears and a note in my grandmother's handwriting that Marshall read aloud. 4. These are better than yours, and you know it. Made the not quite laugh sound beside me. Her eyes were bright. My father sat with the same composure. The specific bequests were small. He had come for what was not small. His hands stayed flat on the table. Marshall turned to the next page. He took a breath, not a theatrical breath, not a performed one, simply the breath of a man who has been holding something in trust for 5 years and is about to release it into the room where it belongs. The following pertains to the real property at 114 Marsh Road, he said, including the land, the structure, all permanent fixtures, and all contents not otherwise in the preceding bequests. The fluorescent light hummed. The clock ticked. His hands tightened on her purse. My mother's misaligned button caught the light. I, Ruth, being of sound mind and full testamentary capacity, confirmed in writing by my physician, Dr. Sandra, 3 days prior to the signing of this document, do hereby bequeath the real property at 114 Marsh Road, in its entirety, solely and without condition, to my granddaughter, Nora Ellen. The words entered the room the way my grandmother had always entered rooms, without announcing themselves, without requiring a response before they had finished arriving, with the complete confidence of something that had been decided and did not need approval. Nobody spoke. My father's face did not change for 3 full seconds. I watched it, the composition held, the jaw set, the hands flat. 3 seconds of complete stillness, like a structure that has absorbed a force and is calculating whether it can remain standing. Then he stood up. His chair scraped against the hardwood with a long, ugly sound, the sound of something being pushed back hard against its resistance. This is not what she wanted, he said. She was confused. She was 80 years old and she was not thinking clearly, and whatever he told her she was signing. Mrs. Physician certified her full testamentary capacity in writing 3 days before the signing, Marshall said, without raising his voice. The certification is in this folder. Additionally, Mrs. dictated several of the will's specific clauses herself, in this office, with 2 witnesses present. If you would like to examine the physician's letter. I don't want to examine anything. This is insane. Mr. Marshall said, with the specific, measured patience of a man who has been in rooms like this before and knows that the person standing up is not the person in the stronger position. Please sit down. There is a letter. My father stood for a moment longer, the sport coat, the polished shoes, the hands that had gone from flat on the table to hanging at his sides where they looked, without the table to claim, less purposeful. He sat down. Marshall unfolded a single sheet of paper from the back of the folder. The same blue-black ink, the same left-handed forward-leaning slant that I had been reading for 2 weeks in the notebook, and that I now recognized the way you recognize a voice in a crowded room, immediately, completely, before you have consciously processed why. Mrs. left a letter, Marshall said, with instructions that it be read aloud in the presence of all parties at the time of the will reading. I will now read it. He cleared his throat. To my family, he read, I am writing this because some things need to be said out loud, even if I am no longer present to say them. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. My father was very still, looked up from his hands for the first time. On the morning of September 15th, Marshall continued, my son-in-law left my granddaughter alone in this house during a Category 4 hurricane. He sealed her bedroom window from the outside with a sheet of plywood and 4 screws. My daughter drove the second car and did not object. The power to the house had been cut before they left. Nora sat in the hallway closet with 3 animals, and a flashlight I had given her 3 months earlier because I knew, as I believe and also knew, that she would need her own light. His head came up fully. He looked at my father. Then he looked at me. Something moved across his face that was not the expression he had worn when he got in the truck with his earbuds in. Something older and less comfortable, the expression of a person who has been knowing something for a long time without nomming it, and has just heard it named in a room where the nomming could not be undone. Marshall continued. I give this house to my granddaughter, Nora, because a family that leaves a child in a storm does not deserve the shelter that child protected. This is not a punishment. It is a correction. I have been making corrections my whole life. This is the last one. The fluorescent light hummed. The clock ticked. My mother's shoulders folded inward, her hands still at her mouth, the mascara beginning its slow descent in 2 thin lines down her cheeks. There is one additional matter, Marshall said, closing the letter and reaching for the second section of the folder. An insurance claim was filed following the storm under claim number 4471B with Southeastern Mutual Insurance. The claim listed Nora Ellen as the on-site witness and included a signature attributed to her on the witness attestation form. The settlement of $44,000 was disbursed to R as primary policyholder. He slid the insurance form across the table. The signature on the witness line does not match Nora's known signature. The capital N sits flat. Hers has always leaned forward. Ruth noted this discrepancy in writing 8 days after the claim was filed, in a personal record she kept for the 5 years following the storm. That record is present in this room. He looked, briefly, at the dish towel on the table. My father's face went the color of wet concrete, not pale exactly, but drained of its particular warmth, the specific color of a face that has been found out and has not yet assembled its response. Looked at him. The expression on his face had settled into something I recognized from the few times in our childhood when had been confronted with something he could not talk his way out of or scroll past, a raw, unguarded recognition. The look of a person who did not know everything but had always suspected enough. He looked at me. I looked back. I did not smile. I did not perform any satisfaction I was feeling. My grandmother had not smiled in her letter. She had stated things. I would state things. I would like to address the insurance matter, I said. My voice was level. I had discovered, somewhere in the long nights with the documents on the table, that I was capable of a steadiness I had not known was in me until the situation required it. The same steadiness I had discovered in the hallway closet at 11:14 at night, listening to the roof demonstrate what Category 4 wind could do to a structure that had decided to hold. I reached into my bag. I placed the brass key on the table, the spare house key, the one with the masking tape on the grip that still said Ruth in faded marker. "This is my house now," I said. "I am giving formal notice of 30 days to vacate the premises. Marshall will provide the written notice by end of business today." My father leaned forward. "You can't." "She can," Marshall said, "and the notice will be filed as stated." "I maintained that house," my father said. The composure was genuinely thin now, not performed thinness, the real kind, the kind that arrives when the structure has absorbed more than it was built to hold. For 13 years, the roof, the yard, the foundation work, I kept it standing. "You lived in it," I said, "rent-free, for 13 years, in a house that was never yours, while telling people the woman whose name was on the deed was losing her mind." His mouth opened, then closed. The sport coat, I noticed, had shifted slightly on his shoulders during the last 10 minutes, not dramatically, but enough. The way clothes shift when the body inside them has changed its relationship to the room. "About the insurance claim," I said, "the signature is not mine. You have two options. Return the $44,000 to Southeastern Mutual voluntarily, or I file a fraud report. Those are the choices available." The room was very quiet. The clock ticked. The fluorescent light hummed its thin, constant vibration. Outside on Clement Street, a car passed, its sound briefly audible through the window and then gone, the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business on the other side of the glass, while the room above the barber shop held what it was holding. My father's hand trembled on the table. Not rage, something slower and heavier than rage. The specific trembling of a man watching consequence arrive after a long journey and finding that it has carried everything he left behind it. My mother looked at me, the mascara in 2 thin lines, the blouse buttoned wrong. She looked like a woman who has been standing in front of something for a long time without looking at it and has finally turned around. "I'm your mother," she said. "I know," I said. "That's why this hurts." I did not specify which part. I did not need to. Spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges, the voice of a man who has been silent in too many rooms and is testing what it sounds like to stop. "I'm sorry, Nora," he said. "I should have stayed. I should have said something when he put the plywood up. I was in the truck and I could see him from the passenger window and he stopped. I put my earbuds in." I looked at my brother across the table. 29 years of him. The soda from the fridge, the evening shifts, the truck with the earbuds. The truck with the earbuds while our father drove 4 screws into a window frame and our sister stood on the other side of it. "I know you're sorry," I said, "but sorry doesn't return that night." He nodded. He looked back at his hands. My father stood. He did it slowly. The movement of a man whose body has registered something his mind is still processing, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. He pulled his jacket straight with both hands, a small automatic gesture, the last available form of composure in a room where all the others had been used up. He walked to the door. He opened it. He closed it behind him, not a slam, a slow, deliberate pull, the sound of a man trying to preserve something he had already lost, not knowing that the preservation attempt was itself a kind of admission. The door clicked. The clock ticked. Exhaled beside me. My mother stayed in her chair. She looked at the key on the table, the masking tape, the faded marker, Ruth in my grandmother's handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Where are we supposed to go?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The question of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not plan for and is trying to locate themselves. "Marshall will send the formal notice," I said. 30 days. That's the legal period." "Nora." "Mom," I said it gently. As gently as I could say it, which was gentler than she might have expected. "I am not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because it is correct. Grandma made the distinction for me. Kindness and fairness are not the same thing. This is fair. She looked at the key again. Then she stood slowly and picked up her bag. She did not hug me on the way out. She paused at the door and looked back once at me, at the notebook still wrapped in the dish towel, at the room in which the morning had gone the way it had gone. Then she left. Was last. He stood from his chair at the far end of the table and walked toward the door and stopped beside me. He stood there for a moment, not speaking, not performing, just standing. I enrolled in a trade program, he said. Electrical. I started last month. I looked at him. I'm trying to wire things correctly, he said. From the start this time. I thought about the flashlight on the bookshelf, about the wrench echoing in the empty apartment, about my grandmother on her knees in the garden saying good hands run in this family. That's a start, I said. He nodded. He left. The room was quiet. Marshall gathered his papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has completed something he has been working toward for a long time and is allowing himself, in the completion, the small satisfaction of a task correctly done. Sat beside me with her purse in her lap, her cardigan buttoned to the top, her eyes still bright from the letter. I picked up the key from the table, the masking tape, Ruth in faded marker. I turned it over in my hand. She the font, I said. Marshall looked up from his papers. She called me on a Thursday evening to confirm it, he said. She said she wanted it legible at reading speed, and she had a preference for serif typefaces because she found sans serif fonts presumptuous. I laughed, the real kind, the kind that arrived without permission. Laughed, too, the full version, not the not quite laugh. The actual laugh of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has been given permission to set it down. The clock ticked. The fluorescent light hummed. And in the room above the barber shop on Clement Street, on a Monday morning in March, with the spring light coming through the east window and the documents back in the green folder, and the notebook still wrapped in the dish towel, and a key with masking tape on the grip sitting in my palm. Something that had been built across 5 years of blue-black ink in a left-handed forward-leaning slant came to its conclusion. Not an ending. A completion. There is a difference. My grandmother had taught me that too. The 30 days passed the way significant waiting periods pass, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the end approached, the days losing their individual weight and becoming instead a single accumulating pressure toward the morning when the notice would expire and the house would be ready. I went to work. I ran the commercial job on Hawthorne Street. I called on Wednesdays. I did not call my parents. Marshall handled the communications with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting 5 years to handle them and was not going to allow sentimentality to slow the process. The formal 30-day notice was filed by end of business Monday. The Southeastern Mutual letter went out Tuesday, a voluntary repayment request, the documentation attached, the forged signature included as an exhibit. Marshall had told me, when we discussed the options, that voluntary repayment was the rational choice. He will choose it, Marshall said, not from remorse, from calculation. A fraud investigation involves federal insurance statutes. He understands numbers. He was right. The check arrived at Marshall's office on the 19th day, $44,000, drawn on an account I did not know my father had, made out to Southeastern Mutual Insurance in full. Marshall called me when it cleared. Rational decision, he said. Minimum, I said. Yes, he said, but sufficient for our purposes. I thought about my grandmother's letter. Be fair, not kind. There is a difference. The $44,000 returned was fair. It was not a confession, not an apology, not an acknowledgement of anything beyond the calculation that repayment was preferable to investigation. It was the minimum fairness that the situation enforced rather than the fairness a person chooses because they understand what they owe. I accepted it as what it was. My parents moved out on the 26th day. Called to tell me, not to report, simply because she had been watching and she knew I would want to know, and she had decided. After 38 years of being my grandmother's neighbor, and 5 years of counting screws and witnessing wills and attending will readings in cardigans buttoned to the top, that being the person who called with information I needed was a role she intended to keep. Your father's truck made 3 trips, she said. Your mother's car made 2. They took the furniture. The kitchen clock, the curtains from the living room, a pause. They left the herb garden. They don't know what the herb garden is, I said. No, said, they don't. I drove to 114 Marsh Road on the 28th day, 2 days before the notice expired, which was legal, because the house was mine, and I was not required to wait until the last hour of the last day if I chose not to. I drove the work truck, my name on the magnetic sign on the door, the toolbox in the bed. The street looked the same from the end of the block, the oak tree visible above the roofline, the screened porch, the fence line where the marigolds had been and where I intended to put them back. The maple I had been picturing for weeks, fuller than I remembered, the March light giving it a particular quality, the bare branches just beginning to show the first faint suggestion of what April would bring. I parked in front of the house. I sat in the truck for a moment. The house had a different quality from the street than it had on every previous occasion I had looked at it from this angle. Every previous occasion I had looked at it as a place I was visiting, a place that had my grandmother in it, which made it feel like home, but a place that was not legally or practically mine. A place I left in the evenings. Now I was looking at it as the person it belonged to. The difference was not in the house. The house was exactly as it had always been. The difference was in what I brought to the looking, which is always where the significant differences live. I got out of the truck. I walked up the path. I used the key with the masking tape, Ruth in faded marker, my name added beneath it in pencil the day before, the 2 names fitting on the tape with a small gap between them that seemed correct. The house was emptier than I had anticipated. They had taken more than the furniture, the kitchen clock, yes, and the living room curtains, but also things I had not predicted. The rug in the front room, the mirror in the hallway, the ceramic dish by the front door where Keys had always lived, the one that had been there since I was 8 years old and that I had assumed was too small and ordinary to be worth taking. It was gone. The nail it had hung on was still in the wall, a small, specific absence. The negative space of a thing that had been somewhere so long its removal was more noticeable than its presence. I walked through the rooms slowly, the way I had learned to walk through a house when assessing work, not looking for what was there, but for what the space was telling me about what it needed. The living room, empty, the outlines of the furniture visible in the carpet where it had pressed the fibers down across 13 years. The kitchen, the clock gone from the wall, the hook still there, the counters clean but bare, the cabinet above the refrigerator holding 3 cans of soup they had not wanted and a box of tea bags, peppermint, my grandmother's brand, the tin almost empty. I picked up the tin. I held it for a moment. The smell of it faint, the last of it, was entirely and specifically hers. I set it back on the shelf. The herb garden was through the kitchen door and across the small back porch, the same porch where we had sat at Christmas with our tea and the leather notebook and the dormant winter beds. The garden was not dormant now. It was March, and March in coastal Georgia had decided, in its particular coastal way, that the growing season required no further introduction. The sage was there. Of course it was there. It had survived the storm, the drought, 13 years of occupants who did not know what it was or why it mattered. It did not require knowing. It simply kept growing. I crouched down beside the sage bed. The leaves were gray-green, fragrant even in the cold, the texture of them between my fingers exactly as it had always been, slightly rough on the upper surface, softer underneath. The smell released immediately when touched, the particular smell that had been in this garden since before I was old enough to know its name. Salvia, my grandmother had told me once, snapping a leaf and holding it for me to smell. Means of the workshop. It was medicine before it was seasoning. She had taught me the names of things. Not just the common names, the real ones. The ones that told you what something actually was. I pinched a leaf. The smell rose. I'm here, I said. To no one. To the garden. To the house. To whatever remained of a woman who had spent 5 years building something in blue-black ink, so that the morning I crouched in this garden would be the morning it was rather than something else. The oak tree at the back of the garden was beginning to bud. The same first suggestion I had noticed on the maple from the street, the season arriving in its particular incremental way, the change happening at the tips first and working inward. My grandmother had planted it the year she retired. It was taller than the roofline now. It would be taller still by the time I had lived here as long as she had. I intended to live here that long. I went back inside. I started where I always started, the kitchen sink. The pipe underneath had developed, in the weeks of reduced occupancy, the faint drip that pipes develop when they are not regularly used and the fittings have had time to settle. A minor issue. A familiar one. I opened the cabinet under the sink. I got on my back on the kitchen floor with my work light clipped to the cabinet frame above me, the specific position I had been in under kitchen sinks since I was 17 years old, and my grandmother had a leaking pipe, and nobody else was going to fix it. The fitting was corroded at the joint, not badly, not a replacement situation, a cleaning and reseating job. 20 minutes. I worked carefully, the way she had taught me to work, not rushed, not performed, the right tool for the right task, the attention given to the problem rather than to the idea of solving it. Halfway through, I became aware of the house around me in the particular way you become aware of a space when you are under a sink with your eyes on a fitting, and your attention narrowed to the specific task. The way it sounds, the way it settles, the particular quality of the silence of a house that has been yours for 28 days on paper, and is becoming yours in the more important sense right now, on the kitchen floor, with a wrench and a work light and a corroded fitting that needed attention. I thought about being 17 in this same position. The same kitchen, the same cabinet, the same floor tiles that were the same floor tiles, because nothing about this kitchen had been changed in the 13 years my parents had lived here. Not the tiles, not the counters, not the window above the sink through which you could see the herb garden if you were standing rather than lying on your back under the cabinet. My father had walked through this kitchen while I was under the sink. He had stepped over my legs and opened the refrigerator and said, to no one in particular, "You're really going to do that for a living." I tightened the last fitting. I turned on the water. I listened. Silence. The specific, clean silence of a pipe that has been correctly attended to. No drip. No settling. Simply the sound of water moving through a properly sealed fitting without loss. I lay on the floor for a moment longer, looking at the underside of the cabinet above me. The wood was old and clean, slightly dusty at the edges. A small pencil mark in the corner that I could not read from this angle, but that was in the particular shade of graphite that suggested it had been there a long time. Old houses accumulate these, small, inexplicable marks that mean something to someone who is no longer there to explain them. I would learn this house, all of its marks and its sounds and its particular ways of settling. I had time. I slid out from under the cabinet. I sat up on the kitchen floor. The afternoon light was coming through the window above the sink at the angle of a mid-March afternoon, not the amber light of summer evenings, something cooler and clearer, the light of a season that is arriving rather than departing. Knocked at the back door at 4:30. She had watched my truck in the driveway from her kitchen window, she said, and she had made a blackberry pie that morning, and there was no reason for a whole pie to be eaten alone when there was a neighbor right there. She came through the back door with the pie in both hands and a bottle of something she described as a reasonable and an expression that was the specific expression of a woman who has been waiting for this particular afternoon for a very long time and is allowing herself, carefully, to feel the full weight of its arrival. She looked around the empty kitchen. "They took the clock," she said. "I noticed. Your grandmother bought that clock at a church sale in 1993. She paid $4 for it, and it kept perfect time for 30 years. Set the pie on the counter. He knew exactly what he was taking." We ate the pie standing at the counter because there were no chairs yet. I had not brought furniture. There had not been time, and the house being empty felt, for tonight, appropriate. The first evening in a space that is becoming yours is better spent with the space itself rather than immediately filling it. My grandmother had told me something like that once, or I had understood it from watching her, which amounted to the same thing. The pie was good. It was reasonable. The kitchen was quiet around us, the specific, inhabited quiet of a space that has been emptied and is beginning, with very small increments of presence, to fill again. "She knew you'd start with the sink," said between bites. "Did she say that?" "She said, Nora will fix the kitchen's sink first. She'll do the pipe under the cabinet. She'll lie on the floor and she won't rush it." Looked at the cabinet under the sink. She said it the way she said things she was certain of, like a fact rather than a prediction. I looked at the cabinet, the small pencil mark I had not been able to read from below. I crouched down and opened the door. I took out my work light and directed it into the corner. The pencil mark was a date, September 1989. Below it, in the same pencil, a note in the left-handed forward-leaning slant I now knew the way I knew my own. Pipe replaced. Quarter-turn valve. Good for 30 years if maintained. She had repaired this pipe herself, 34 years ago. She had written the date and the repair in pencil on the inside of the cabinet, where only a person lying on the kitchen floor would find it. I looked at the note for a long time. She had known, when she wrote it, that the next person to repair this pipe would be lying on the floor in the same position she had been in, looking up at this same mark. She had not known who that person would be. She had left the note anyway, the way she left everything, in the right place, for the right person, trusting that the right person would eventually be there to find it. "September 1989, I said. "What?" came to look. I moved the work light so she could see. Looked at the note. She was quiet for a long moment. "She was 44 when she wrote that," she said. "I remember that September. Her husband had just died. She repaired the pipe herself because there was no one else and she didn't want to wait." A pause. She never waited for someone else to fix what she could fix herself. I sat back on my heels. The kitchen light was doing what kitchen lights do in the late afternoon, making everything in the room look warmer than it was, the surfaces glowing slightly, the old tile and the bare counters and the empty wall where the clock had been. "I'm going to put a clock there," I said. "A good one." "Your grandmother," said, "would have specific opinions about what constitutes a good clock." "I know." I stood up. "I intend to honor them." Looked at me for a moment, the specific look of a person who has known someone's grandmother for 38 years and is finding, in the person standing in front of them, evidence of that grandmother in unexpected places. Not the obvious places, the particular places. The way a person stands on a kitchen floor after fixing a pipe. The way they look at a pencil note in a cabinet corner. "You're very like her," she said. Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation, a precise one. I took the peppermint tin from the shelf above the refrigerator. Almost empty, 1 or 2 cups left in it. I filled the kettle at the newly sealed sink and set it on the stove and waited for it, the way she had waited for things, without rushing the waiting. The kettle boiled. I made 2 cups. And I stood at the kitchen counter in the empty house with our tea and the remains of the blackberry pie between us. And outside the kitchen window, the herb garden held the last of the afternoon light. the sage gray-green and certain, the dormant beds waiting for what the season was bringing, the oak tree at the back of the garden beginning, at its tips, to green. "What happens now?" said. I looked at the garden, at the pencil mark visible through the open cabinet door, at the wall where the clock would go. "Now I learn the house," I said, "all of it." Nodded. She drank her tea. Outside, the light continued its March work, the slow shift from afternoon to evening, the garden going from green to shadow, the oak tree holding its new buds against the cooling air with the patient certainty of something that has been growing long enough to trust the season. I thought about the note in the cabinet. September 1989. Pipe replaced, quarter-turn valve, good for 30 years if maintained. She had been 44. She had repaired the pipe herself because there was no one else, and she did not wait. I was 28. I had repaired the same pipe, different fitting, same cabinet, same floor, same light coming through the same window, and I had not waited either. Good for 30 years if maintained, she had written. I intended to maintain it. I intended, in fact, to maintain everything she had left me. The garden and the oak tree, and the sage that did not ask permission to keep living, and the notebook on the shelf, and the flashlight beside it, and the specific inherited practice of counting what needed to be counted and writing it down, and trusting that the right person would eventually be in the right place to find it. The kettle had gone quiet. The tea was cooling. Outside, the first star was appearing above the oak tree, early, faint, barely visible against the still pale sky, but there. There it is, I thought. In her voice. There it is. Spring arrived in the herb garden the way my grandmother had always said it arrived. Not announced, not dramatic, simply present one morning in a way it had not been the morning before. I found it on a Tuesday. I was at the kitchen window with my first coffee, looking at the garden in the unfocused way of early mornings when the eyes are open before the attention is fully engaged, and something in the quality of the light through the window was different, warmer, more direct, carrying something the February light had not carried. I looked at the herb beds. The rosemary along the back fence had put out new growth overnight, tiny, bright, the particular green of new rosemary that is more vivid than the established gray-green of the mature plant, as though the new growth is trying harder to be noticed. I set my coffee down. I went outside in my socks, which my grandmother would have considered impractical and which I considered worth it. I crouched beside the rosemary. The new growth was soft between my fingers, the smell of it rising immediately, that clean, resinous smell that she had described once as the smell of something that has decided to keep going. She had said it about plants. She had meant it about people, too. The thyme was greening along the border of the front bed. The sage, which had never entirely stopped, was fuller now. The winter had not diminished it, only steadied it, and the spring was returning what the cold had held in reserve. Salvia, I said to it, means of the workshop. I went back inside and finished my coffee standing at the window, watching the garden in the morning light. This had become, across the month since I moved in, the first ritual of every day, the window, the coffee, the garden. Not because my grandmother had told me to do it, because I had found myself doing it and recognized in the finding that it was correct. That this window and this garden and this particular morning light required this specific attention, and that providing it was not a task, but a form of belonging. The house had been teaching me things since the first day. Not the practical things, those I had arrived with, in the toolbox, from 8 years of professional work and a lifetime of watching how things were built and why they failed. The other things. The things a house teaches when you stop moving through it and start listening to it. The third stair from the landing that held a note in its left side, a specific low resonance, like a string held slightly below its proper tension. The way the east window in the front bedroom caught the sunrise at an angle that turned the wall beside it briefly gold for approximately 9 minutes, then let it go. The cabinet in the bathroom that had to be opened at a particular angle or the catch stuck, a matter of millimeters, easily adjusted, but she had not adjusted it, and so I was leaving it as it was until I understood better why. Some things you learn before you change them. I had found, across the month, that she had left marks throughout the house in the same way she had left the pencil note in the kitchen cabinet. Small, specific, in the right place for the right person to find them when they were lying on the floor or reaching into the back of a shelf, or checking the underside of a window frame as part of a standard inspection. A date and a notation in the attic hatch. A measurement penciled on the wall behind the bathroom door. In the garden shed, on the shelf where the good pruning shears now lived alongside the ones had brought over the day after she received my grandmother's bequest, a small card in her handwriting. The shears want oiled twice a year. March and September. The can is on the bottom shelf. The can was on the bottom shelf. I had oiled the shears. Each mark was the same thing in a different location. The practice of a woman who understood that the most useful information is placed where the person who needs it will find it at exactly the moment they need it, rather than delivered in advance when it cannot yet be properly received. She had been placing information for me my whole life. In the garden on Saturday afternoons. In the flashlight on the nightstand. In the notebook she had handed me at Christmas with its rubber band and its 5 years of blue-black evidence. In the pencil, on the inside of the cabinet door. Good for 30 years if maintained. I was maintaining everything. The Saturday program began in April. This requires some explanation, and the explanation begins with a phone call from a woman named, no relation to Marshall. She clarified immediately when she introduced herself, though she had known him for years through the community board, who called on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March to offer condolences about my grandmother and to mention, almost as an aside, that the anonymous funding that had supported the community garden education program for the previous 11 years had not yet been renewed for the current year, and the program coordinator was uncertain how to proceed. I sat down at the kitchen table. Anonymous funding, I said. For 11 years, said. Always in March. Always the same amount. Always without a name or a note, just a bank transfer from an account the coordinator described as belonging to a private individual. The coordinator, that's me, I should clarify, assumed that when the transfer didn't arrive this March it was because the situation had changed. What does the program do? I asked. Described it. A Saturday morning program for children from the surrounding neighborhoods, many of whom had no access to growing space. They learned to grow things in raised beds in a room with good light. They learned the names of plants, the common names, and for those who were interested, the real ones. They learned that something planted carefully and tended consistently would produce something it would not produce if left alone. Saturday mornings, 11 years, anonymous. I thought about my grandmother on the porch with the leather notebook, writing in the evenings. About the herb garden on Saturday afternoons, my grandmother on her knees beside me, snapping a sage leaf and saying means of the workshop. It was medicine before it was seasoning. About every Saturday of my adolescence that I had spent in this garden learning the names of things, the real ones, in the specific and unhurried way of someone being taught by a person who had decided the teaching mattered. She had been teaching other children on Saturday mornings. For 11 years. Without telling anyone. How much is the annual funding? I asked. Told me. I'll continue it, I said. Same amount, starting now. A silence, brief, the silence of a person recalibrating. You're her granddaughter, said. It was not a question. Yes. She talked about you. On the Saturday mornings when she came to check on the program. Paused. She said she was just passing. She was never just passing. She was watching. checking on the things she had put in motion, making sure they were growing the way they were supposed to grow. The way she checked on the rosemary in March and the sage in October and the thyme along the border of the front bed, not intrusively, not with the expectation of acknowledgement, simply with the quiet attention of a person who had planted something and wanted to know it was holding. The first Saturday morning of the spring session, I arrived at the community center at 8:15. Met me at the door, a compact, energetic woman in her 50s, with the specific energy of someone doing work they believe in so thoroughly that the belief has become structural, load-bearing, the kind of conviction that holds a program together across 11 years of anonymous funding and uncertain springs. The room had large east-facing windows that caught the morning light in a way that made the growing tables glow. Raised beds along 3 walls. Seedlings in small pots on every sill, labeled in children's handwriting that ranged from careful and architectural to urgent and slightly sideways. The smell of damp soil and new growth. The particular smell of a room where things are consistently being asked to become what they have the potential to become. On the far wall, a planting schedule, hand-drawn, colored, annotated with 11 years of accumulated practical knowledge. I looked at it for a long moment. The handwriting changed across the years, mostly, but at the earliest sections, at the very bottom of the first column where the schedule had begun, a different hand. Smaller, more precise, left-leaning. I stepped closer. The earliest entries were hers. She had drawn the first planting schedule. 11 years ago, on a Saturday morning, she had sat down in this room and written out the sequence. What to plant and when, what each plant needed, how to read the signs that something was growing correctly and the signs that something was not. The foundation of 11 years of Saturday mornings, in her handwriting, on a wall in a room I had never been in before. She was still here. In the schedule on the wall. In the children who had learned from the schedule. In the children those children would teach someday, in rooms I would never see, using knowledge that had traveled through the specific chain of Saturday mornings she had built and paid for and attended anonymously for 11 years. The children arrived at 9. 15 of them, ranging from 6 to 12, carrying the particular morning energy of children who have chosen to be somewhere on a Saturday rather than been sent, which is a categorically different energy. A girl named, 7 years old, with the focused expression of a person for whom precision is not a performance but a genuine preference, was transplanting basil seedlings from the starter tray to individual pots. She worked with her tongue at the corner of her mouth, the universal expression of a person giving a delicate task their complete attention. Each seedling lifted carefully from the tray with a small stick, its root ball kept intact, set into its new pot with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the root ball was the part that mattered. She set the last one and looked up at. Is that right? Looked at the row of pots, each seedling upright, each root ball undisturbed. That's exactly right, said. I stood at the edge of the room and watched move to the next task with the same focused attention. The task completed correctly, the correction not sought again, the confidence of a child who has been shown something properly and trusted to apply it. I thought about my grandmother crouching in the herb garden on a Saturday afternoon, snapping a sage leaf, saying salvia, means of the workshop. The precision she brought to the nomming, the patience she brought to the teaching, the understanding that what you give a child on a Saturday afternoon, properly, carefully, without rushing, is what they carry into every Saturday after it. Knew how to transplant a seedling without disturbing the root ball. Somebody had shown her correctly. Somebody had been showing children correctly in this room every Saturday for 11 years, because a woman on Marsh Road had decided, without announcing it, that this was something worth funding and attending and watching grow. I drove home from the community center at noon through streets that were fully spring now. The trees along the main road in new leaf, the light warmer and more direct than the light of 2 weeks ago, the air carrying the particular smell of a season that has fully committed. I drove past Clement Street without turning in, but I thought of Marshall in his office above the barber shop, and I felt toward him the specific gratitude you feel for a person who has handled something important with complete skill and asked for nothing beyond the fee, which I had paid, and which would never be adequate. I parked in front of the house. I sat for a moment looking at the oak tree above the roofline, the new leaves fully open now, the tree committed to the season in the complete and unambiguous way of a thing that has been growing in the same place for a long time and knows what it is supposed to do. My grandmother had planted it the year she retired. She had carried it home from a nursery in a paper bag. She had put it in the ground in the back of the garden and watered it and watched it and made small notes about it in whatever notebook she was keeping at the time. This was before the leather one, before the storm, before the 5 years of blue-black evidence. Simply a note about a tree she had planted because she intended to stay and because she understood, in the way she understood most things, that the things worth having took time. 31 years later, it was taller than the roofline. I had been here for 1 month. I intended to be here long enough to see how much taller it got. Called on a Thursday evening in April. I was in the garden, deadheading the early marigolds along the fence line. She had left instructions for this in the garden notebook I had found in the shed. A spiral-bound book separate from the leather one, dedicated entirely to the garden's specific needs, and organized by month with the thoroughgoing precision of a retired nurse who understood that the difference between a healthy plant and a failing one was usually documentation. I almost did not answer. The of the previous year, the truck with the earbuds, the studio he had moved to, the single text that said, "I know it's not enough, but I'm trying," had not called since, and I had not called him, and the silence had been, if not comfortable, at least honest. Neither of us pretending to a closeness that the morning of the storm had made complicated. But it was April. Things were growing, I answered. I finished the first module, he said. The electrical program. I passed the assessment. I heard you enrolled, I said. Yeah, a pause. I wanted you to know I passed it. I don't know why exactly. He stopped. I wanted you to know. I was crouching beside the marigolds, my grandmother's pruning shears in my hand, the good ones, oiled in March per the card on the shed shelf. The garden smelled of damp earth and new growth, and the faint resinous smell of the rosemary along the back fence. How is it? I said. Hard. He said it without self-pity, which was new. The theory is harder than I expected. But the practical work, another pause longer, the pause of a person finding something they did not know they were looking for. The practical work feels like something I'm supposed to be doing. I thought about my grandmother's voice. Good hands run in this family. She had said it at the dinner table, while my mother passed the salad to, and my father did not look up from his plate, and I had thought she was talking about me. Perhaps she had been talking about all of us, the hands we had been given, and the different things we had done with them, and the particular, ongoing, unfinished question of what we would eventually do with what we had. That's a good sign, I said, when the practical work feels like something you're supposed to be doing. Yeah, he said, I think so. The call did not last long. There was not yet enough between us for a long call. The distance of years and the morning of the storm, and the truck with the earbuds and the Will reading and everything that had been named in that room above the barber shop was not resolved by a past electrical module and a Thursday phone call. Distances like that close slowly, if they close, and they close through accumulation rather than through single acts. But he had called. He had told me he passed. Late, I thought, but not silent. I finished deadheading the marigolds in the evening light. The garden smelled of what had been cut back and what was growing to replace it. The oak tree at the back of the garden held the last of the April light in its new leaves, each one translucent at the edges, the light coming through them and making them briefly, vividly, completely themselves. I put the pruning shears back on the shelf in the shed. The card was still there. The shears want oil twice a year, March and September. The can is on the bottom shelf. March done, September coming. I was keeping track. That evening I sat at the kitchen table with the garden notebook open to the May section. The next month's tasks laid out in her handwriting. What to plant, and when and how much. The sequence of the season as she had understood and recorded it across the years she had tended this ground. I read through it carefully, the way I read her things, not for information only, but for what the information told me about how she thought. The reasoning underneath the instruction. The understanding that produced the specific recommendation. She did not write things down without understanding them. She had taught me that without saying it directly. I wrote my name at the top of the May page in pencil, small in the margin, the way she had written dates in the margin of the cabinet note, not claiming the page, joining it. On the shelf in the living room, the leather notebook and the yellow flashlight stood side by side where I had placed them the day I moved in. I had arranged them that way deliberately, not as decoration, not as memorial, but as the two volumes of the same story they were. The flashlight she had chosen because she knew I would need my own light. The notebook she had kept because someone needed to be counting and nobody was. I looked at them from across the kitchen. She had given me the light before the storm. She had been keeping count throughout it. These were not separate acts. They were the same act, repeated in different registers, the single continuous act of a woman who had decided that the person in front of her was worth the full attention of her care. I was in my grandmother's house, my house. The pipe under the sink was sealed. The shears were oiled. The marigolds were deadheaded. The May tasks were read and noted and waiting. The Saturday program was funded for another year. The oak tree was taller than the roofline and getting taller. I was maintaining everything. I made peppermint tea from the tin. I had bought more, the same brand, from the same shop where she had always bought it. The tin slightly different in design, but the tea itself identical. The smell of it rising from the cup exactly as it had always risen from hers. I carried it to the back porch. The April evening was cool and clear, the kind of clear that comes after a week of rain when the air has been washed and the sky has decided to be specific about itself. The garden was in shadow, but the oak tree caught the last of the light above the roofline. Its leaves lit from above, glowing faintly. The tree visible in the dark the way things are visible when they are large enough that the light finds them even after it has left everything else. I sat in the chair she had sat in at Christmas. The same chair, the same porch, the same garden going from dusk to dark, while someone held a cup of peppermint tea and thought about the things that needed thinking about. I thought about the pencil note in the cabinet. September 1989. Pipe replaced, quarter-turn valve, good for 30 years if maintained. She had been 44. Her husband had just died. She had gotten on the kitchen floor and fixed the pipe herself because there was no one else and she did not wait. I was 28. I had gotten on the same floor and fixed the same pipe because the fitting had corroded, and it was my house, and it needed doing, and I knew how. Between those two moments, the September of 1989 and the March of this year, was the whole of what she had built. The house maintained, the garden tended, the program funded, the notebook kept, the will signed, the evidence assembled, the right things left in the right places for the right person. I thought about S's room with the planting schedule on the wall, the earliest sections in her handwriting, the foundation of 11 years of Saturday mornings, written once and still present, still in use, still teaching. I thought about transplanting basil seedlings with her tongue at the corner of her mouth, her root balls intact, her pots in a straight row. Is that right? That's exactly right. The chain of it. The way something taught on a Saturday morning in a garden on Marsh Road became something taught in a room with east-facing windows on the other side of. became something a 7-year-old named would carry into every garden she ever stood in, becomes something she will teach someday to someone who will not know where it started. My grandmother had started it. She would not have called it a legacy. She would have called it maintaining something that needed maintaining. She would have said it in the flat, practical voice she used for things that were obvious, a weather report, not a speech. She would have been right. She was usually right. I finished the tea. I set the cup on the porch rail. The garden was fully dark now, the oak tree a shape against the sky rather than a lit thing, but present, solidly, present, the way things are present when they have been growing in the same place long enough to be part of the ground itself rather than something placed upon it. I thought about the notebook on the shelf in the living room. I had been thinking, for several weeks, about something had said the morning of the first Saturday session. Almost as an aside, between showing me the planting schedule and introducing me to the children, the way important things are often mentioned, in the space between two other things, by people who are too busy doing them to frame them as significant. We don't have any record of how it started, she had said. 11 years of Saturday mornings and no one wrote it down. The schedule is there, but not the story of it. Not the children who came through in the early years, or what they grew, or who taught them. None of that. She had said it with the mild, practical regret of a person, nodding an absence they have not yet had time to address. I had been thinking about it since. About what it meant to record something. About the difference between a schedule on a wall and the story of how the schedule came to be, and why it mattered, and whose hands had planted the first seedling in the first raised bed on the first Saturday morning 11 years ago, when a woman from Marsh Road had driven over to check on things, saying she was just passing, and stayed long enough to write the planting sequence in her careful left-handed slant. About how the things that matter most are the ones most easily lost when no one writes them down. About a leather notebook on a porch in the evenings. About someone who had decided that someone needed to be counting, and nobody was. So she counted. I went inside. I took the leather notebook from the shelf. I carried it to the kitchen table. I sat down in the chair that was mine now, his chair before that, hers before that, the chair that faced the window and the garden, and I opened the notebook to the page after my grandmother's last entry. Her last entry, February 10th. I am tired, but the notebook is finished. My line beneath it, I'm still here, Grandma. I'm still showing up. The next page, blank. I picked up the pen. I wrote at the top of the page, for the record. Then I began. Summer came into the house, the way summer comes into old houses that have been built for it, through the screened porch and the east windows, and the particular cross-ventilation of rooms arranged by someone who understood that coastal Georgia in July required architectural consideration rather than mechanical intervention. My grandmother had understood this. The house had been arranged accordingly. I opened the windows she had always opened and closed the ones she had always closed, and the house did what it had always done, which was breathe. I was learning to breathe with it. July was the hottest month and the best month for the herb garden. The basil that had been tentative in April was fully committed now, the leaves large and fragrant, the plants pressing against each other along the bed in the specific crowding of things that are growing faster than they were planned for. The rosemary had gone woody at the base in the way of established rosemary, the new growth soft at the tips, the whole plant producing more than one person could use. I cut it and hung it to dry in the kitchen the way she had always hung it, from the hook above the window, the bundles tied with kitchen string, the smell of it filling the room for the 2 weeks it took to dry properly. The time was edging out of its bed along the front border. She had noted this tendency in the garden notebook. Time will expand beyond its allocation if not redirected. Redirect firmly but without apology. It does not take offense. I redirected it firmly and without apology. It did not take offense. The Saturday program ran through July. a summer session that had been planning for 3 years and had finally been able to schedule now that the funding was stable. 15 children in the spring session, 18 in the summer, the numbers growing in the way that good things grow in communities that are paying attention. I came on the third Saturday of each month. Not as an authority, ran the program with the complete competence of 11 years, but as an additional presence, a person who knew the names of the plants in both their registers and was willing to get on her knees in the soil beside a 9-year-old who had questions. Came every Saturday. She had become, across the months, the program's unofficial ambassador for precision, the child who checked the other children's root balls, who noticed when a seedling was sitting at the wrong angle in its pot, who asked the Latin names of things and retained them with the specific retention of a child who understands that the real name tells you something the common name does not. On a Saturday in late July, she asked me why Sage was called. I looked at her. 7 years old, her hair in 2 careful braids, her attention entirely and specifically on the question she had just asked. Means of the workshop, I said. It was medicine before it was seasoning. The name tells you what it was used for before anyone called it an herb. Considered this for a moment. So the real name is about what it does, she said. Yes, I said, that's exactly it. She looked at the sage plant in front of her, with the renewed attention of a person who has just been given a new way of seeing something they thought they already understood. I thought about my grandmother on her knees beside me in this same garden, 20 years ago, snapping a sage leaf and saying salvia in the specific voice she used for things she considered worth precision. I had been 8 years old, approximately's age, with approximately's capacity for the real name over the common one, and my grandmother had known this and had taught accordingly. The chain of it. I could see it clearly now, not as a metaphor, not as a comfortable way of thinking about loss, but as an actual, specific, ongoing chain of information passing from one person's hands to another's across time. The links forged on Saturday mornings in gardens, in rooms with east-facing windows, on kitchen floors under cabinet doors with pencil notes in the corner. She was still teaching. Through me, through whoever would teach someday in a garden she had not yet found. The record was growing. I had been writing since April, in the leather notebook, in the pages after my grandmother's last entry and my own single line, building towards something I had not yet fully identified. Not quite a history, not quite a memoir. Something between the two, in the specific space between documentation and story that my grandmother had occupied in her own writing. The blue-black entries that were precise enough to be evidence and human enough to be true. I wrote about the Saturday mornings, about and the root balls and the real name of Sage, about's planting schedule on the wall, the earliest sections in my grandmother's handwriting, about the chain, how it had started on a Saturday afternoon in a herb garden on Marsh Road and had become, through 11 years of anonymous funding and careful attendance, something that was teaching children in a different room across town. I wrote about the house, the pencil note in the cabinet, the third stair and its particular resonance, the 9 minutes of gold light on the bedroom wall each morning, the cabinet in the bathroom that required a specific angle. I wrote about the storm. This was the hardest section, not because the facts were difficult. I knew them precisely. I had read them in my grandmother's handwriting on September 15th, but because writing them meant choosing a register. I could write them as my grandmother had written them, dated, precise, the evidence of a nurse who understood that the most important records are the ones kept without embellishment. Or I could write them as I had lived them. The green sky, the sealed window, the 4 screws going in one by one with the sound like a fingernail on porcelain. I wrote them both ways. Then I found the register that was neither one alone. The register where the precision and the lived experience occupied the same sentence without one displacing the other. The register she had spent 40 years developing. I was learning it. On a Wednesday in August, cleaning out the last of the boxes I had not yet unpacked. A procrastination I had been maintaining cheerfully for 4 months. The boxes stacked in the back bedroom where they did not interfere with anything and could be ignored with minimal effort. I found something I had not known I was looking for. A shoebox. Not mine, too old, the cardboard softened with years, the brand on the lid one that had not existed for at least a decade. My grandmother's handwriting on the top in pencil. For Nora, not yet. I sat on the floor of the back bedroom with the shoebox in my lap. Not yet. The same words she had used when I was 17, and I had caught her writing fast in the leather notebook on the porch, and she had looked up and closed it and said, "Not yet, sweetheart," in the voice she used for books she was not finished reading. She had been not yet-ing this shoebox for years, possibly for as long as I had been coming on Saturday afternoons and learning the names of things and fixing pipes and being, without quite knowing it, prepared. I opened it. Inside, organized with the thoroughness I had come to expect from her in all things, were 3 items. The first was a bundle of envelopes, letters, tied with the same kitchen string she used for the dried sage bundles. My name on each one, in her handwriting, in the particular blue-black ink. The return addresses on the envelopes were not hers. They were from organizations, a nursing foundation, a horticultural society, a literacy program, and I recognized the name of from a sign on the community center where the Saturday program ran. I untied the bundle. I opened the first envelope. It was an acknowledgement letter, the kind that nonprofits send when a donation has been made in someone's name. This letter confirms a contribution made in honor of Nora Ellen by Ruth. I opened the second, the same, a different organization, the same language. I counted them. 11 envelopes, 11 organizations, 11 years of donations made in my name to programs across the Nursing Foundation, the Literacy Program, the Horticultural Society, a trade scholarship fund at the community college, a tool library on the east side of town that lent equipment to people who needed it for single projects and couldn't justify the purchase. A tool library. She had donated to a tool library in my name. Every year for 11 years. In my name. While I was in the apartment on Elm Street fixing faucets and running commercial retrofits and calling her every Sunday about the garden and Scrabble strategies, she had been building something else alongside the will and the notebook. A record, in the formal language of charitable acknowledgement letters, of who I was and what I cared about, and what the world looked like when someone paid attention to it with both precision and love. I set the letters on the floor beside me. I picked up the second item from the shoebox. A photograph. Small, slightly faded at the edges, the particular fade of a photograph that has been handled often. 2 people on a screened porch, the same screened porch, the same house, the same garden visible behind them. One of the people was my grandmother, younger than I had ever known her, maybe 50, 55, sitting in the chair. She always sat in with her hands in her lap, and the expression she wore when she was at rest rather than at attention. Not the focused expression of a woman recording things, but the softer expression underneath it, the one that appeared on Saturday afternoons in the garden when the light turned amber and she had said everything she meant to say. The other person was me, 8 years old, sitting beside her on the porch rail with a sprig of sage in my hand and my mouth open as though I was in the middle of asking something. I did not remember this photograph being taken. I did not know who had taken it, but I was 8 years old and she was 50-something, and I was asking about the plant in my hand, and she was about to answer me in the specific, unhurried way she answered all questions that she considered worth the full answer. I looked at us for a long time. The chain of it visible in one photograph. Her hands, her voice, the sage leaf, the 8-year-old asking the real name. All of it here already, in the summer of whenever this was taken, before the storm, before the notebook, before the will and the forged signature and the will reading and the deed. All of it already present in an afternoon on a screened porch with a sage leaf and a question. She had been building this for much longer than 5 years. She had been building it since the first Saturday. Since the first Saturday I came, and she handed me a pair of gardening gloves that smelled like beeswax and said, "Come on then. I'll show you what needs doing," in the voice she used for things that were obvious. The third item in the shoebox was a piece of paper, folded once, my name on the outside in her handwriting. I opened it. Not a letter this time. Shorter. A single paragraph in the blue-black ink, the left-handed forward-leaning slant, the words placed with the economy of a woman who understood that the most important things could be said briefly if you chose the words precisely. "Nora, you will find this when you're ready, which means you've already fixed the sink and oiled the shears and started writing the record and begun to understand what the chain is. I know you will because I know you, which is something I have been doing carefully and with great pleasure for 28 years. The shoebox is not a surprise. It is a confirmation. You were always going to be here. I was always going to make sure of it. I love you more. And longer. Long enough to have started all of this before you knew you needed it. Grandma Ruth." I sat on the floor of the back bedroom with the shoebox in my lap, and the letters around me, and the photograph in my hand, and the piece of paper, and I did not try to manage what happened next. I cried. Not the stunned, dry-eyed variety of the first weeks after she died, the feeling too large for crying kind. This was the other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below grief and below love, in the place where the two things have been living together for so long they cannot be separated. The place where the full weight of being known, genuinely, specifically, across 28 years, arrives all at once, and the body's only available response is tears. I cried into my own sleeve on the floor of the back bedroom, while the August afternoon pressed warm against the windows and Biscuit came, and put his head in my lap, and Fig sat in the doorway watching with the calm, assessing yellow-eyed patience of a creature who has decided that what is happening is significant and warrants witness. I let them both stay. I cried until I was finished. Then I dried my face on the dish towel I had brought upstairs for no reason I could now remember, and sat quietly for a while with the shoebox and the letters and the photograph of us on the porch. The 8-year-old in the photograph was asking about the plant in her hand. My grandmother was about to tell her. 20 years later, the 8-year-old knew the answer. She was teaching it to a 7-year-old named on Saturday mornings in a room with east-facing windows, and would teach it to someone else someday, and the chain would continue for as long as there were Saturday mornings and children with questions and people who understood that the real name tells you something the common name does not. She had started the chain. I was one of its links. I intended to be a good one. I put the photograph on the mantelpiece in the living room, between the leather notebook and the yellow flashlight, the three things arranged in the particular order they belonged in. The flashlight she had given me before the storm, the notebook she had kept throughout it, the photograph of the afternoon that had made everything that came after it possible. Not a shrine, a record, the visible record of a chain. Then I went downstairs. I put the kettle on. I stood at the window above the sink while it heated and looked at the herb garden in the August afternoon light, the basil crowding its bed, the rosemary drying on the hook above the window, the thyme redirected firmly along the front border, the sage gray-green and unhurried and certain of itself in the specific way of things that do not require permission to keep going. The kettle boiled. I made the tea. I carried it to the back porch and sat in her chair. The garden held the late afternoon light in the way it had always held it, the herbs catching the amber, the oak tree at the back of the garden throwing its long late shadow across the beds, the screened porch smelling of old wood and whatever was growing closest to it, which in August was the basil and the jasmine that had come back along the fence line without being asked. She had sat here for 31 years. I had sat here for 5 months. I had the rest of my life to learn the difference between those two things, and to close it incrementally, Saturday by Saturday and season by season, until the chair knew me the way it had known her, as the specific weight and presence of a person who had been sitting in it long enough to belong. My phone buzzed on the armrest. I looked at the screen. My mother. I looked at it for a moment. The August garden, the tea cooling in my hand, the photograph on the mantelpiece inside, visible through the kitchen window at this angle, the 8-year-old with the sage leaf, the woman who was about to answer her. I answered. Nora, her voice was careful, the voice of a person who has been rehearsing an approach and is now committed to it. Mom. A pause. I drove past the house today. The herb garden looks good. I looked at the herb garden. The basil pressing against itself in the late afternoon light, the rosemary on the hook above the kitchen window visible from where she would have passed on the street, the sage doing what sage always did. It does, I said. Another pause, longer. I'm in a gardening class, she said. Tuesday evenings at the community center, container gardening. They gave us a basil plant at the first session. I held the phone and looked at the garden. How is it? I said. It's alive. A small pause. I've been reading about it, what it needs. I didn't know basil was particular about water. It is, I said. It wants consistent moisture but not wet feet. The soil should feel like a wrung-out sponge. A wrung-out sponge, she said. I'll remember that. The call did not go further than that. There was not yet enough between us for it to go further. The whiteboard and the 4 screws and the diner and the 3 stirs of the coffee spoon and the will reading and everything that had been named and left unnamed were not resolved by a Tuesday evening gardening class and a basil plant and a mother calling to say the herb garden looked good. But she had called. She had been paying attention to the garden. She was keeping a plan alive. These were not large things. They were small things, exactly as small as a Tuesday evening class and a wrung-out sponge, and a drive past a house on Marsh Road that was not hers anymore. Small things, in the right direction. I did not reach for more than they were. My grandmother had taught me not to reach for things until I knew exactly what I was reaching for. What these were was a beginning, tentative, uncertain, carrying the full weight of what had preceded it, moving slowly in a direction that had not been available before. That was what it was. I would not make it more. I would not make it less. Consistent moisture, I said. Not wet feet. Check it every morning and it'll tell you what it needs. Every morning, she said. Yes. We hung up. The garden held the last of the August light, the amber going, the shadow of the oak tree lengthening across the beds, the basil losing its color to the dusk, while the sage stayed visible the way sage always stayed visible, certain of itself in the dark the way it was certain in the light, the way things are certain when they are deeply rooted. I thought about my grandmother saying wanted warm, and I gave her fair, and I was wrong about that. Not entirely, but enough. I thought about the shoebox, the letters in my name. 11 years of donations to programs in that she had made in my name, not to programs I would necessarily have chosen, but to programs she had chosen on my behalf, which was different and more interesting. The record of what she believed I cared about and would eventually care about more consciously if given the time and the house and the Saturday mornings to arrive at it. She had been building my character in her records for 28 years. She had done it accurately. I picked up the pen I had brought to the porch with me. A habit now, always the pen on the porch, the same blue-black ink she had used, which I had found in the desk in the study in a box of 12, and which I intended to continue using until I understood whether the color mattered or only seemed to. I opened the leather notebook to the page I had been writing on. The record was 31 pages now. In my handwriting, which was not hers, wider, less slanted, the letters less certain of their direction, but in her ink in the same notebook, on the pages she had left blank after her last entry. I wrote about the shoebox, about the 11 letters, about the photograph on the porch, the 8-year-old with the sage leaf, the mouth open in the middle of a question. I wrote about my mother's call, the basil plant, the wrung-out sponge. Then I wrote what I had understood, sitting in the back bedroom on the floor with the shoebox in my lap, and the letters around me and the photograph in my hand. She started all of this before I knew I needed it, before the storm, before the notebook, before the will. In the Saturday afternoons when I was 8 years old and she was handing me gardening gloves that smelled like beeswax and teaching me the real names of things. She was already building then. She had been building from the first Saturday. I used to think the chain started with the flashlight, or the notebook, or the will. Now I think it started in the garden on a Saturday, a long time before the storm, when a woman crouched beside her granddaughter in the time bed and said, "The real name tells you what it actually is." She was right. She was usually right. I know what I actually am now. I am the person she spent 28 years building. I am the chain. I intend to be a good one. I closed the notebook. I capped the pen. The garden was fully in shadow now, the last of the August light gone from the beds, the oak tree dark against the darker sky, the first stars beginning above the roofline in the specific way that stars begin in coastal Georgia in August, earlier than you expect, the sky deciding on dark before you are entirely ready for it. That was all right. I had my own light. She had made sure of that long before I needed it. I went inside. I set the notebook on the shelf between the flashlight and the photograph. I looked at the three of them for a moment, the light she had given me, the record she had kept, the afternoon that had started everything. Not a shrine. A record of a chain. Mine to continue. I went to the kitchen. I turned on the light, the warm overhead light that she had chosen specifically, a warmer bulb than standard, the kind that makes the room feel inhabited rather than merely illuminated. I stood at the window above the sink and looked at the dark garden. The sage was still visible. Of course it was. It did not require the light to be certain of itself. It just kept growing. October came back around. A full year of it now. The complete circle. Every season turned once in this house that was mine in the felt sense as well as the legal one. The two kinds of ownership having converged somewhere across the months of fixing and planting and recording, and sitting on the back porch with peppermint tea, while the garden did what gardens do when they are tended by someone who has learned their particular language. I was learning it. I was not finished learning it. That seemed correct. The herb garden in October looked different from the herb garden in March, fuller, more established. The plants having spent a full season being attended to by someone who consulted the garden notebook before she acted, and then acted without apology. The rosemary along the back fence was woody and substantial now, its new growth silver green at the tips, the smell of it released when I brushed past with the same immediate, specific generosity it had always had. The sage was exactly what sage always was, certain of itself, indifferent to the season's opinion, green in October as it had been green in January, as it would be green in the January after that. The oak tree had been dropping leaves since the second week of September. Not dramatically. One, and then another, and then another. The tree releasing what it no longer needed with the unhurried patience of something that understands that the letting go is preparation for what comes next. The leaves came down on the back porch and across the herb beds in small accumulations that I raked into the compost bin on Saturday mornings, which was where they belonged, which was where they would become, eventually. The thing that fed the beds that grew the herbs that I hung to dry from the hook above the kitchen window. Everything returned. Everything continued. She had understood this about gardens long before I did. I was at the kitchen window with my first coffee on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, when I understood the last thing she had been building. Not dramatically, the understanding arrived the way her understandings always arrived, quietly and without announcement, settling into my chest before I had fully registered it. I was looking at the herb garden in the particular October morning light that I had now seen enough times to recognize as specifically this house's light at this hour in this month. The light that made the sage look silver and the rosemary look bronze and the oak tree at the back of the garden look like something out of a photograph of itself. I was looking at all of this and thinking about the record, the 37 pages now, growing slowly toward something I had not yet fully named, and I understood. She had not been building evidence. She had not been building a case, though the case was real and the evidence was irrefutable and the will had held and the house was mine. Those were the form of it, the necessary, practical, legal form of what she had built. But the form was not the thing. The form was the container. The thing inside the container was something else. She had been building a record of a person. Not a legal person, not the person on the deed or the witness attestation form or the charitable acknowledgement letters with my name on them. The other kind of person. The kind that exists in the specific accumulation of Saturday afternoons and Sunday phone calls and kitchen floors and sage leaves and real names and peppermint tea, and the particular quality of attention, given consistently, and without announcement across 28 years to a child who was worth the attention and needed someone to know it. She had been building me. Not the me that existed regardless of her. I would have existed regardless, would have fixed pipes and learned the names of things and driven away from the storm and found the apartment on Elm Street and carried my toolbox from job to job and lived a life that was mine and small and sufficient. That me existed without her help. The other me, the one that knew what she was building and why, the one that could sit on a kitchen floor in a back bedroom and hold a shoebox and understand what 11 letters meant. The one that could receive a phone call about a basil plant and know exactly what it was, exactly as small as it was and not smaller, and give it the right amount of room. The one that could write for the record at the top of a blank page and mean it in the full sense of what records are and why they matter. That me was her construction. Built on Saturday afternoons, assembled across 28 years. Completed, she had said she was tired, she had said the notebook was finished. She had gone to bed in February and not woken up at exactly the right moment. When the construction was sound. When the person inside it was ready to inhabit it fully. She had known when it was finished because she was a nurse and a gardener and a keeper of records. And she had spent her entire adult life understanding the difference between something that needs more time and something that is ready. I was ready. She had made sure of it. I set my coffee down. I went to the back porch. The October morning was cool and clear, the kind of clear that arrives in coastal Georgia when the summer heat has finally committed to leaving the air sharp at the edges, the light precise, every plant in the garden casting a shadow that had a definite edge rather than the soft, diffuse shadow of summer. I sat in her chair. The garden held the morning light the way it held every light, completely, without reserve, offering back whatever was given to it by the sky and the season and the hour. The sage caught it and went silver. The rosemary went bronze. The time along the front border went that particular gold that time goes in October when the season has made its final agreement with the temperature, and the plants are making their own agreements in return. I thought about the first Saturday. I was 8 years old and she had handed me gardening gloves that smelled like beeswax and said, "Come on then. I'll show you what needs doing," and I had followed her into the herb beds and crouched beside her in the dirt and asked the name of the plant I was holding, and she had told me, the real name, not the common one, the name that told you what it actually was. I had not known, crouching in the dirt at 8 years old, that this was the beginning of anything. She had known. She had been building from that afternoon, from that sage leaf in an 8-year-old's hand, from that question and that answer and the gardening gloves that smelled like beeswax and the particular patience of a woman who understood that the most important things take the longest and that the length of time required is not a problem with the construction, but a feature of it. 20 years from that afternoon to this one. The oak tree at the back of the garden had gone full October, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental committed way of trees that have been in the same place long enough to know exactly what they are supposed to do in October, and do it thoroughly. The leaves were amber and bronze, and the occasional deep red of one that had decided to commit fully to the season. The light came through them and made them briefly, vividly themselves before the letting go. She had planted it the year she retired. She had carried it home in a paper bag. She had put it in the ground because she intended to stay and because she understood, in the specific way she understood most things, that the things worth having take time and that the time is not a cost but a part of the value. 31 years of October mornings. The tree taller than the roofline. I thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece. The 8-year-old with the sage leaf and her mouth open in the middle of a question. I thought about transplanting basil seedlings with her tongue at the corner of her mouth. Is that right? That's exactly right. The chain, visible from here, from this chair, this porch, this October morning, in its full length. The first Saturday to the last. The sage leaf to the basil seedling. The 8-year-old asking to the 28-year-old answering. The notebook kept to the record being written. The flashlight given to the light still burning. She was still here. In everything she had tended. In everything I was tending. My phone buzzed on the armrest. I looked at the screen. A message from a photograph. In the Saturday program, crouching beside one of the raised beds, her hands in the soil, her expression the focused expression of a person giving a delicate task their complete attention. Behind her, on the wall, the planting schedule, the earliest sections in my grandmother's handwriting, still there, still in use. Below the photograph's message, she asked me today who wrote the first planting schedule. I told her. She said, I want to learn to write like that. I said, start by learning to look like that. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I wrote back, tell her the looking comes first, the writing follows. That's how it always works. I set the phone on the armrest. I looked at the garden. The sage, the rosemary, the thyme, the oak tree at the back, its leaves coming down one and then another in the October air, the tree releasing what it no longer needed, getting lighter by degrees, preparing for the long, quiet season that makes the next spring possible. The letting go that is also preparation. She had known this too. She had known everything about gardens, the real names and the common names and the difference between them, and the difference between the plant that needed redirecting and the plant that needed time, and the difference between a thing that was finished and a thing that needed more season. She had applied all of this to people as well as plants because she was a nurse and a gardener, and she understood that living things operate by the same principles regardless of their category, that they want consistent attention and honest assessment and the specific, unhurried patience of someone who trusts the process rather than rushing the result. She had trusted the process. The process had produced this October morning. I stood from the chair. I went to the kitchen. I filled the kettle at the sink with the pipe I had repaired in March following the note she had left in the cabinet in September of 1989. The same pipe, the same joint, different fitting, the repair that had felt like prayer and the silence after it like the silence of something correctly attended to. I put the kettle on. I stood at the window while it heated and looked at the herb garden in the October light. The same window, the same garden, the same October light that had come through this window every October for 31 years while she stood here in the same position, looking at the same herbs, thinking whatever she had thought in the mornings before the day required her full attention, and the garden had it briefly to itself. I was standing where she had stood. I was looking at what she had looked at. The kettle boiled. I made the tea peppermint her brand from the tin on the shelf above the refrigerator that I replenished when it ran low. Same brand, same shop, the ritual mattering more than the flavor. I poured 2 cups. I carried both cups to the back porch. One for me, one for the armrest beside the chair, not as a ceremony. Simply as what felt correct on an October morning, when the garden was doing what it did in October, and the oak tree was letting go with the patient certainty of something that trusts the season, and the record was 37 pages in the notebook on the shelf inside, and the chain was continuing in a room with east-facing windows across town, where a 7-year-old named had decided she wanted to learn to write like the person who wrote the first planting schedule. The looking comes first, the writing follows. That was how it always worked. I picked up the pen from the armrest, the blue-black ink, her brand, from the box of 12 in the desk in the study. The leather notebook opened to the current page, page 38 now, the record continuing, building toward something I had been circling for months and was finally ready to name. I wrote, October, the oak tree is letting go, one leaf and then another. The garden is doing what it does, and I am sitting in her chair watching it do it, and I understand now what she was building. Not the will, not the notebook, not the deed or the case or the 34 years of maintaining this house and this garden and the 11 years of Saturday mornings funded anonymously across town. Those were all real and all necessary and all correctly done, but they were not the thing. The thing was this chair, this garden, this October morning. A person sitting in it who knows the real names of things and how to fix the pipe under the sink, and when to redirect the time and how to tend what she was given. She built a person who could receive what she left. That was the construction. That was the whole of it. I am the person she built. I am also the person who is now building, who is writing this down, who is funding the Saturday mornings, who answered the phone when my mother called about the basil plant and gave her the right amount of room, who is going to oil the shears in September and plant the beds in April and call on Wednesdays and sit in this chair for as many Octobers as the chair and the garden and the oak tree and this body are given. She gave me the light before I needed it. She counted every screw. She wrote it all down. I am going to keep writing it down. Because someone needs to be counting, and I know how. She taught me. I capped the pen. I closed the notebook. I set it on the armrest beside the second cup of tea, still warm, the steam rising in a thin thread in the October air, going upward and dissolving the way steam does when the air is cool enough to show it and warm enough to receive it. The garden held the morning. The sage held the morning. The oak tree held the morning in its bronze and amber leaves that were still holding and would hold until they were ready to let go, and then would let go with the specific, uncomplaining ease of things that trust the season. I looked at the photograph in my mind, the 8-year-old on the porch with the sage leaf and her mouth open in the middle of a question. What was she asking? I had not known, looking at the photograph in August on the floor of the back bedroom. I had assumed she was asking the name of the plant, the real name. But sitting here in October, in her chair, with the record 38 pages long and the chain visible from the first Saturday to this morning, I understood what the question actually was. She was asking, what is this? Not just about the plant. About everything. About the garden and the gardening gloves and the Saturday afternoons, and the woman beside her who had decided that this particular 8-year-old deserved the full answer and not the common one. What is this? And my grandmother, 50-something, her husband not long gone, the house around her and the garden in front of her and a child beside her in the dirt, had said, This is salvia, means of the workshop. It was medicine before it was seasoning. The real name tells you what it actually is. She had been answering the larger question, too. She had been answering it for 20 years. And I finally, fully, on a Tuesday morning in October, in her chair, with the record in my hands and the garden in front of me, and the oak tree taller than the roof line, and the chain continuing in a room across town, where a 7-year-old had decided she wanted to learn to write like the person who wrote the first planting schedule. I finally had the full answer. This is what it is. A house on Marsh Road, screened porch, herb garden, oak tree taller than the roofline. A pipe under the sink repaired twice, once in September of 1989 and once in March of this year, both times by someone who got on the floor and did it themselves without waiting. A planting schedule on a wall across town, the earliest sections in a left-handed forward-leaning slant, still teaching. A leather notebook on a shelf beside a yellow flashlight, and a photograph of an 8-year-old with a sage leaf and her mouth open in the middle of a question. A chain. Started on a Saturday afternoon, still going. A person who knows the real names of things and is learning more of them every Saturday. A person who writes it down. A person who was given a light before she knew she would need it and has been carrying it ever since and intends to carry it forward. Into every house and every herb bed and every Saturday morning and every child who looks up from a seedling and asks, is that right? For as long as carrying is possible. That's exactly right, I will say. Because she showed me. Because she showed me what it looked like when someone decided that a person was worth the full attention of their care. The Saturday afternoons, the real names, the flashlight chosen specifically, the notebook kept throughout, the will signed in October, the shoebox marked not yet, and I am going to spend the rest of my life showing other people the same thing. Not as a debt, not as a tribute, as a chain, as what it actually is. I picked up the tea. I drank it in the October morning on the back porch of 114 Marsh Road, which is my house now, and has been becoming more fully my house with every season and every pipe and every entry in the record, and every Saturday and every leaf the oak tree lets go and every one it holds. The garden was doing what it did. I was watching it do it. This was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything she had been building toward. And it was mine. The sage was still green. Of course it was. Salvia, I said to it, means of the workshop. The sage did not respond. It kept growing. That was its response. That had always been its response. The one thing it knew how to do and did without interruption and without requiring acknowledgement and without being told that the doing mattered. It mattered. Everything that kept growing mattered. Everything that continued mattered. I was going to continue. She had made sure of it long before I knew I needed to be sure. That was the whole of it. That was exactly right. If this story has reached you, if somewhere across these 10 parts you have recognized a Saturday afternoon, a real name given when a common one would have been easier, a flashlight placed before the storm arrived, leave me a comment. Tell me the name of the person who built something for you in silence before you knew you needed it. Tell me what they taught you about the real name of things. I read every single one. I carry them into every story I tell. And if you want another story, about a woman who finds a set of letters hidden in the walls of a house she is renovating, letters that reveal a secret her family kept for 50 years, and that changes everything she thought she knew about where she came from, it is waiting for you in the description below. It begins with a name written in someone else's handwriting on the back of a photograph. She has been